And we don't often get a chance to really provide an overview of all the incredible work that the folks in utilities and their partners are doing in this area. So with that, I am going to ask Joe Tadeucci, our Director of Utilities, to take it away.
Thank you, Nuria, and good evening, Mayor Pro Tem and members of council. I don't think the mayor is with us tonight, so I don't want to leave him out, but I am Joe Tadeucci, and I am the Director of the Utilities Department. And tonight we are here to talk about the stormwater and flood utility. And this is a topic and a general flood discussion that we've done with City Council every few years. The last time we've had a discussion like this was in 2020, just before we were getting ready to kick off our flood master plan. There's a lot to the utility, as you'll hear tonight, and it's really nice to have an opportunity to have this discussion when council isn't under pressure to make a decision on a specific project. Part of the reason that we're doing this now in the end of January is that there will be some activity coming up here in February and March on one of our flood projects that will require council action. And if I could have the team go to the next slide. So even though there are 4 topics on this agenda, we've really broken the presentation into 3 parts. The first part is an overview of the flood utility. It's probably the longest part of our presentation in terms of the number of slides, and we'll talk about the comprehensive flood plan that was approved by council in 2022. Then we'll talk about community outreach, and then we'll have some updates on key projects. And we think it'll work best if we go through each of the 3 sections first, and then stop for discussion and questions for council as we have written them in the memo, and we'll have the questions here on the screen. If we can go to the next slide. So this slide shows the team that works on all of our stormwater and flood capital projects. And I'll just go quickly through the team. Many of the council members are familiar with Brandon Coleman, I'm sure. He is actually the supervisor and leader of this team, and he's also our project manager for the South Boulder Creek Flood Mitigation Project. And then Kristen Capateas is leading our Gregory Creek project. Debbie Fisher is leading our Upper Goose Creek and 2 Mile Canyon Creek project. And then Allison Wolf leads our local state stormwater drainage improvement projects. And then Angela Urego is in a new position in our communications department, and it was created specifically for supporting our flood utility projects. And I feel really privileged to have the opportunity to work with this team. They have great energy. And a few years ago during the pandemic, poor Brandon, we were just down to 1 person, and it was Brandon in our flood utility. And so we were able to do some recruitment. And tonight, as I mentioned previously, you're going to hear about engagement, and we've really hired with an intention people who can work with the community that are passionate about the work, including the city values and the environment and climate and our equity goals. And then in addition to the team members shown on this slide, you'll also hear from Chris Douglas tonight. Chris leads our whole utilities engineering team that does all the capital projects across all 3 of the utilities: water, wastewater, stormwater, and flood. And then I wanted to mention that Chris Douglas, Kristen, and Angela will be presenting to City Council for the first time this evening. So you'll hear from all of them, and we're excited for them to have this opportunity. One last thing about the team and kind of our organizational structure. So tonight you're going to hear about the flood utility in the utilities department. There is also another element of covering flood work in the city of Boulder that is taken care of by our planning and development services team. And that's the floodplain regulation and the permitting that goes with that. So anytime a developer is wanting to do something that involves a floodplain, they work with the PNDS staff on that, and our two departments work closely on those projects. If we could go to the next slide. And then in terms of talking about our team, I also want to introduce a really important partner to our city flood utility. We are really privileged and pleased to have the executive director of the Mile High Flood District with us tonight, Laura Krager, and Kurt Bauer, who is also with us. And Kurt is the district's watershed manager for the Boulder Creek watershed. So I might pause here if Laura is in the meeting as a panelist, and maybe let her say a few words about the Mile High Flood District.
Thank you, Joe. It's nice to see all of you tonight, especially some current and former board members. So just here to give you a little introduction to the district if you're not familiar with the Mile High Flood District. We were enacted by the state legislature in 1969 to really manage stormwater at a regional level to reduce flood risk. Our mission and vision is to protect people, property, and our environment. We do that through preservation, mitigation, and education. So that's kind of what we do in a nutshell. And I'm hoping one of the services that you are familiar with is our flood warning program, because that actually started based off of the risk that the city is in because of Boulder Creek. And so we started that program back in the 80s to try to give as much warning as we could in regards to prediction of flooding. Our boundary, as you can see here, goes from Boulder and down to Castle Rock, but doesn't quite cover Castle Rock. We're about 1,600 square miles. We service about 3 million people in the metro area. And we get our funding from a mill levy. And in the community in Boulder County pays 9/10 to the district. That's 1/10 of a mill for our general services, then 4/10 for construction and design, and then 4/10 for maintenance. And the big part of how we work with our funding, as Joe says, we're a partner with you, is we're here to leverage the dollars that you could bring to the table so we can maximize the benefits to our community by working together in a very collaborative way. I'm going to stop there because that's a lot to kind of digest. And as we go through, I will be here if you have any questions that come up. But it sounds like, Joe, maybe we want to get through more of the presentation.
Sure, we can do that, and if you're able to stick around for a little bit when we get to the end of the first part, maybe we could start with questions for the district so that you don't have to stay on all night, and we can let you go. But
sounds great. I'll be here.
All right. Well, thank you, Laura. And so next, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Douglas, and he'll get us started on the overview of our utility.
Thank you, Joe, and good evening, Council. As Joe mentioned, my name is Chris Douglas. I'm the Senior Civil Engineering Manager in the Utilities Department. As Joe mentioned, I lead the engineering team for all three of the city's wet utilities. Next slide. So the Utilities Department, as Joe mentioned, is made up of three utilities: water, wastewater, stormwater, and the stormwater and flood management utilities. These utilities are primarily funded by user fees collected from the monthly utility bills. The stormwater and flood management utility collects rainwater and creek flows through the city. This is the utility we're going to dive into a little bit more this evening. I'd like to start a little bit with an overview of the main components of the utility, which includes flood management, stormwater drainage, and stormwater quality. On a very high level, the flood management program includes the 16 drainegeways and creeks that convey water generally from west to east through the city. The stormwater drainage system is the pipes that collect the street runoff and delivers the water to the creeks to be able to continue the storm. And a little more, just a little bit more on those three components is the flood management program is responsible for floodplain mapping, risk assessments, regulations, flood information, flood insurance, emergency preparedness, property acquisition, and capital improvements associated with those 47 miles of creeks and drainage ways that are divided amongst the 16 drainage ways in the city. The stormwater drainage system includes a network of 190 miles of underground pipe structures, channels, that collect stormwater throughout the city. The stormwater system conveys the waters to the major drainage ways. And the stormwater drainage program involves routine inspections, maintenance, repairs, regulatory compliance, and capital improvements to the system. And then finally, the stormwater quality program involves preservation, protection, and enhancement of the surface water. These include compliance with state regulatory requirements and educating the community to foster the shared stewardship of these natural resources. Now I'll hand it over to Kristen Kapatayas, who's going to dive even deeper into the utility.
Thank you, Chris, and good evening, Council. My name is Kristen Kapatayas, and I am a project manager with the Storm Flood Utility. I wanted to start by giving perspective to our flood risk here in Boulder. The city is designated as the most flood-prone city in the state. It's extremely vulnerable to flooding due to a variety of reasons. The one, its geographic location at the base of the Rocky Mountains, and two, its high levels of urbanization and development along the drainage ways. Since Boulder was developed prior to the implementation of the utility, many homes and structures were built within the floodplains of the creeks, reducing or eliminating natural capacity for floodwaters and space for wildlife. As a result, this has jeopardized the health and safety of our community, the protection of properties from floods, and the quality of our ecosystem. This map here on the left shows the 100 and 500-year floodplains along the drainage ways within the city. Since the city was established, there have been over a dozen major floods. The largest on record occurred in 1894, where it is estimated that Boulder Creek reached 100-year levels. When we say 100-year levels, we are referring to areas that statistically have a 1% chance of flooding in any given year. In most recent history, many of us remember the September 2013 floods, in which several days of rainfall resulted in flooding along all the major drainage ways. This risk to flooding in the city is always present, and to some level occurs every year. This image here shows the flooding in North Boulder Park that occurred in June of 2023. Emergency services had to rescue several individuals during that event. As a result of the major historical floods we've experienced in the city and the need to protect the community and enhance storm and flood systems, the utility was established in 1973. Since then, there have been many updates to comprehensive plans that guide our utility. The most recent update was accepted and adopted by City Council in September of 2022. The Comprehensive Flood and Stormwater Plan, or for short, the CFS, has a citywide focus and provides guidance for managing storm and flood systems across the city, with the main goal of protecting the safety of our community and the ecosystem of our drainage ways. Some of the topics addressed include flood management, flood preparedness, and stormwater quality, amongst other issues. These topics were incorporated into a set of key outcomes and recommendations in the update. We as a utility feel that the recommendations in the CFS document and reflect the feedback we heard from the community, embody Boulder's values, and capture the strategic vision of the utility in a way that positions us to move forward expeditiously. There were several key outcomes and recommendations that emerged from the planning process, which shaped the guidance provided in the CFS. Tonight, we'll be focusing on 3 of them. The first, and potentially the most impactful, being the project prioritization framework. The second is providing services equitably by incorporating equity into the policies and decision-making process. And the third, to develop proactive measures to address climate change through infrastructure resilience. I would also like to mention the other key outcomes, which included preparing for the extremes, informing the community to create a prepared community, and maintaining the systems we have. One of the systematic approaches the utility has continued to use with the updated CFS is a life cycle approach. The life cycle begins with identifying the flood risk by mapping the floodplains. Once the mapping is completed, we then identify alternatives to mitigate these risks. The mitigation planning uses a system-wide approach to address flooding holistically and incorporates decisions as part of the community engagement process. After approval of those recommended alternatives, we move to the design and construction phase. This is the phase that addresses more detailed engineering and landowner impacts are better defined. We have 30 major floodway project reaches across the city, as shown by segment in this figure. The project prioritization framework takes these remaining major flood projects left to be built and helps determine which of these should be built when. Historically, in the city of Boulder, projects only focused on a cost-benefit analysis, which resulted in inequities in how projects were selected. With the development of the CFS, we have revised that approach. The project prioritization framework encompasses several key criteria as shown here, which were developed with data we received from the community. Each of these have associated metrics, the majority of which are quantitative. These metrics are then used to assign a weighted value to each project. This criteria is what is used to rank our 30 plus major floodway projects we have and provide an objective way to compare them. I want to highlight an important component of the framework, and that is the inclusion of equity considerations. I understand the graph I've shown here is quite detailed and busy, but I would like to focus on the equity metric for each project that was run through the prioritization framework. Because project prioritization has historically relied heavily on cost-benefit analysis and avoided damages, this has resulted in the past in prioritizing projects for property protection in affluent areas. By including equity considerations using metrics like the Social Vulnerability Index, projects are prioritized in areas where people need them most. For example, some of the projects you can see here on this graph, such as 2 and 3, rank higher than they would have due to the large equity benefits both of these projects have. Climate change is causing widespread disruption in natural systems that threaten the well-being of our communities. In Colorado, we have and will continue to see increases in temperatures, heat waves, droughts, and storm intensity. Changes can lead to an increase in wildfires and changes in precipitation patterns, posing risks to stormwater and flood infrastructure. In Boulder, we are focusing on a couple things to combat this. We are trying to construct resilient infrastructure that is adaptive to changing conditions, accommodating floods and not controlling them by focusing on stream processes that are natural to the creeks and that are lower maintenance, and implementing projects faster. The sooner projects are implemented, the better the community will be protected from frequently occurring storm events. One of the key outcomes from the CFS was emergency preparedness. With the city being one of the highest flash flood risk communities in the state, floods can happen at any time with little to no warning. We work with many different partners to provide emergency response and awareness and to keep the community prepared. As a community member, please sign up for emergency alerts at boco911alert.com. This is the best way to stay informed of alerts in your area. And last, funding considerations and planning for future projects is critical to the CFS. With the city largely being built out prior to the establishment of the storm and flood utility, Boulder is in a position where, unlike some of our neighboring communities, we don't have vast, undeveloped floodplains left. Therefore, we are effectively retrofitting the city with an adequate storm and flood infrastructure. The plan identifies approximately $350 million worth of projects. At the current action level of funding, the city anticipates these projects would be completed in approximately 50 years. During the planning process for the CFS, we received comments that the city should raise rates to what is needed to move at the fastest pace. Conversely, we also received feedback that the city should carefully consider how rate increases will affect those who have limited ability to pay. Based on this feedback, the plan currently recommends moving from the current action level to a vision level of funding to accelerate the pace of completing major flood mitigation projects. At this rate, we would complete projects within a 30 to 35-year time span. Our current 2024 budget is approximately $16 million, with most expenditures being predominantly devoted to CIP work. I will now hand it off to Joe for our first question. Thank you.
Thank you. Make sure I'm unmuted here. Appreciate that, Kristen and Chris and Laura. And for our council members, that was a lot to pack into a series of slides there. So I want to open it up for questions about the general flood utility. And I might just add that the council members who were with us in 2022 and were part of the approval for the master plan have seen a lot of that information before. But one thing that is new for those council members is in that plan, there was the approval of the prioritization formula. And so then after that approval, we went and applied it. So this is the first time that council is kind of seeing how that stacks up and especially how the equity part mixes into it. And I would just remind everybody that prioritization formula was really established through our community engagement process, and the community weighed in on what factors they thought were the most important. And so then we went back and developed that formula. So I'll stop there and see if there are any questions.
See Councilmember Wallach. Hello, Mark.
Hi, good evening. Just one quick question. The debt service portion of your pie chart is obviously going to grow as we engage in more projects. We have a sense of what velocity that component is going to grow, and will it crowd out expenditures for capital improvements?
Yeah, great question. Thank you for that, Mark. And the way the bonding works, the stormwater and flood utility has its own bonds, and then the water and wastewater are separate, and the two of those utilities are packaged together. And so the debt service goes out for 20 years on the bonds that we're doing. And as we were wrapping up the flood master plan and starting to think about rates and the prioritization and where projects would fall, our utilities finance staff were looking closely at how we could space these out over a period of years and what impact that would have on rates. And we have two large bonds in the next, just had one that did really well on a bond sale. And then we'll have another one coming up here within this year. And they're large dollar volumes. But the way we're looking at the rest of them, we're breaking up the projects into like $15 million increments. And we think we can do the rest of them more with just reasonable rate increases. And so we're not necessarily anticipating at this moment in time, a bunch more bonding in the stormwater and flood utility.
Thank you. Great answer. Appreciate it.
Councilmember Benjamin, hello, Matt, bring it in.
Thanks, Taisha. Appreciate that. And really loving the crisp presentation thus far. So appreciate Joe and your team for doing that. It's right on point. Easy to have that stuff become voluminous. So love it, love it. My question kind of piggybacks a little bit on Mark's, which is, I believe, is really about rates and where are we in process of thinking about a rate-based study? Because if I recall, there was one in 2018. And so I'm just wondering where that is in process to think about that as it may help get us to that vision level of funding. So just curious about that rate-based study.
Yeah, for sure. So you're right, 2018 was the last time we did a rate study, and there are a number of reasons in utilities that we're kind of ramping up to do another one here, probably a couple years out. I think for the water utility, we have the tiered water budget structure, and we've learned from the time we've implemented it, there's just a lot of complexity and practicality issues that we'd like to address. And so I would guess late 2025 or 26 is when we would probably have a rate study. And that is something that both the Water Resources Advisory Board and council would for sure weigh in on.
That's great. And part of that's just to give community a sense of time, knowing that it's coming, and that sort of gives them folks a time. So when you were to do a rate study, when would people after that study maybe expect to see rates hit their bills?
Well, the rate study is more about the design of the structure and the framework for how we bill for our services, or that's a big component of it. The rates that we set, and a big part of it for utilities, as you see with the city budget process, is our capital projects. The dollar values are really high. We do a 6-year CIP every year, and it's rolling on 6 years. So we're projecting rates 6 years out. And then as we're doing our analysis, we're trying to look at all 3 utilities for 20 years. And across all 3 utilities, the value of the infrastructure is several $billion, and we know we have a great system, but aging infrastructure that we need to take care of. So one of the things that's on our utilities work plan, partnering with our central finance team, is just doing a long-term financial strategy, because it's easy to fall into a trap of looking at it every year and say, well, the bill's only going up $7, and then you do that for year after year after year. So we really want to be mindful of that, think about the needs of our infrastructure, but also think about people's ability to pay.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that.
Mm-hmm.
Councilmember Spear, hello, Nicole.
Thank you. And thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. I am always impressed by how exceptional the presentations are, particularly from people who've never done this before. So kudos. My question is really just kind of about the budget and how it intersects with some of the funding that we get from Mile High Flood District. And I asked this partly because I have the question, but also to give Laura an opportunity to speak a little bit more to the work that Mile High Flood District does. I've been really impressed with what I've seen. But my question is just around if we've got about $60 million budgeted for this year in 2024, does that include the money that Mile High Flood District is contributing to our projects, or is that considered a separate pot?
So when utilities brings its 6-year CIP through, we for sure think about the overall fund balance and all of the sources of revenue that we have. I don't remember the specific numbers off the top of my head, but the Mile High Flood District funds are in there, and those are really important to us.
Okay, thank you. So it's part of that about $16 million figure.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, not separate. Yep. And then I was just wondering if this is a good opportunity for it. If Laura, you could just maybe speak a little bit more to the value that we get for the money that we're paying into the flood district, or Joe, but again, I feel like it's
Appreciate that that cue. Yeah, I think it's all really about leveraging our resources. So in addition to our funding, when we do a capital improvement project, it's at least a 50% match with our local community. And the reason why that was set up was that so we all had buy-in with some dollars at the table, because you are really the property owner and the long-term owner of that infrastructure. And so we want to make sure that we're both at the table with some equal dollars. But we're happy if you get your funding from any other type of funding source. So I know sometimes Boulder uses like some tip funding through transportation. So we're happy to leverage that when it comes to the deal too. But the other part that we don't talk a lot about is the maintenance. And I think that's a really important part of the district, is recognizing we can build all of these projects, but they do need to be maintained into perpetuity, right? In order to function, to provide that flood control. We do fund that out at 100% if projects that we built with you based off of the request the city puts into us. And so that's a pretty significant benefit, I think, to the city, is recognizing that as we partner on these projects, that we will also be at their table to make sure that they are working well into the future. Does that help?
And if I can add to that, thank you, Laura. That's super helpful, and maybe just an example that people can relate to in Boulder of a maintenance project, and the district does it 100% and provides project management services. And so if you think about the Goose Creek corridor and the multi-use path there, just within the last few years, we used to experience quite a bit of puddling and ponding on the multi-use path, and there was a need for maintenance and managing some vegetation. And so the district came in and did a pretty comprehensive project to help us get that into shape and manage the vegetation and keep it healthy and thriving. And so that is great. And then just from the city's perspective, having the partnership with the district, I know in talking to Laura and Kurt, the district is aware of the intensity of some of our projects and the public interaction. And so they're also a great technical resource. And our city staff, we don't necessarily have all the answers to all the questions that come at us. And I know for myself, I've sometimes consulted with Laura's team and found it very helpful.
Likewise.
Thank you so much. And I just want to correct the title of our incredible Mayor Pro Tem, Nicole Spear. And so again, just wanted to, I noticed I said council member, and my apologies on that. But now we have Council Member Shuhard with his hand up. Ryan, hello.
Thank you. Thank you, Joe, and to the team for this straightforward presentation that I appreciate how well you put together. And also thank you, Joe, for responding to the hotline message I sent earlier this morning. I guess I would maybe just pull kind of a few things from that hotline to ask for you to say a little bit more. And this is sort of in the spirit of asking for kind of a primer on how things work. I'm aware, doing the reading, that there's an incredible amount of analysis and decisions that come into what you presented for us. So I'm really just hoping for kind of some basic education, if you don't mind. And my first question is, it's basically the subject of the second question in the hotline, which is when one thinks about the projects that we're doing for flood mitigation, it looks to me like the kind of emphasis on what we've selected, or on kind of, I don't know what the term is, but like they seem like somewhat site specific or corridor specific, or they're geographically constrained or contained. So correct me if I'm wrong, but assuming that that's right, I'm just curious about the side of the more kind of diffuse citywide kinds of things we might do that could have an impact, specifically around impermeable surfaces, like the incredible area of concrete that we have for our roads and parking lots. And I'm just wondering if you could maybe just talk about this in general. Like, is that to what extent is all of that impermeable surface a driver of our concerns, things we have to manage? Um, Maybe I'll just start there. To what extent is that an important part of what we have to manage that we wouldn't otherwise have to manage if there wasn't so much impermeable surface?
Yeah, for sure. It is a consideration. And Matt had asked about the rate study, and in the last rate study in setting stormwater fees, we recalibrated the stormwater assessment to give people more credit for having impermeable surfaces. So that's one way with kind of a pricing signal built into our funding. A lot of the aspects of that question and our answer get more into the part that I talked about with the planning and development services and the regulatory part and permitting projects. So our teams work closely together, including our climate initiatives team, to just know what the emerging trends are and technologies and following that and trying to build it into our codes and the requirements for projects. And in developing the response to the hotline post, I learned from one of my team members that before we hired her to the city, and that's Debbie, she worked on a project, I think it was a Ball Aerospace, that won an award for being like a 3-acre permeable pavement structure that performed really well during the 2013 flood, and it won some kind of industry award. So I don't, when we get into the permitting and the regulatory part, I'm not as strong in that area, so we could definitely follow up more. But I know, going back to my introduction of the team, there is a real passion for the environment and the climate, and we want to build those things into our projects across the city. And if I could touch on the part of your question about like how we decide, you saw the prioritization work, and then there are some boundary conditions, like we can't build flood and stormwater infrastructure upstream in a drainage if there's nothing downstream that's ready to capture that water that we're harnessing. So we kind of have to work systematically and practically to develop things so that we're not creating more problems like that. And those are all the things that factor into our decisions. The last thing I will say about green infrastructure, and people may not realize it, Boulder Creek, for example, as it comes through from the western edge of town through the civic area, that's actually an engineered stream. And there are features of it, like drop structures that are made out of large rocks and things like that look very natural, but they're there to curb erosion and stuff like that. I'm getting a bit lengthy in my answer, so I might stop there.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate that. So if I could try a follow up, and I don't want to try to get too much into the regulations, because I heard you that I need others for that. But just sort of like conceptually, is it the case that we kind of will take impermeable surfaces anywhere we can get it in Boulder? I mean, just like more or less, and it's all kind of fungible, or is it more the case that there are certain locations in which permeable surfaces are more valuable? Such, I'm just thinking, as we think about the pricing of this, just at a conceptual level, are we kind of just looking to create that there's a value in more what's the word, permeation anywhere we can get it, or is it like no, we need actually to focus in certain areas? And if so, could you talk about that?
I mean, with the 16 creeks running through town, the needs are kind of everywhere, and we definitely value the permeable surfaces. And as I said, addressing that in our rate structure was an important change in the last rate study. And some of the property owners that have large permeable surfaces, that brought community feedback and felt like they weren't getting enough credit for what they were bringing to our stormwater and flood system. And it was a valid point, and we addressed it.
Thanks. And I see Debbie had something to add, if that's okay. Councilmember Taysha. Is that okay if Debbie weighs in?
I didn't see Debbie's hand, so oh,
She
there we
chatted.
go. Yes,
I'm
of
sorry, I was
course.
just gonna tell staff maybe to make sure that we're not chatting because people in our public cannot see the chat. So
That's right.
if you got something to add, feel free to come on in or
Sorry.
raise your hand.
Debbie?
Yeah, if I ask staff
yeah,
to
trying
raise
to
their
un-
hand because I can see that part and not always the chat box. Thank you so much.
I just wanted to quickly add that that's one of my passions is permeable pavements, and I've done a lot of projects related to that. And so to help understand where it works and where it doesn't work, it only works in areas where you can control the amount of sediment and deposition that occurs on the pavements. So streets are not really good choices because they're going to be sanded and salted, and lots of things fall on streets that are going to clog it up. But parking lots, private parking lots, things like that are perfect for that. So I just thought I would throw that in. So a little better understanding of where we could and could not implement such things realistically so they continue to perform as designed.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you,
So
Debbie.
much, Debbie.
Thank you. And
Lauren,
Joe,
you good?
maybe just one more just to kind of.
So,
Oh, may I?
sorry, go ahead. Yes, of course.
Thanks. So again, just like at the conceptual level, Debbie, that was incredibly helpful. I'm just trying to think kind of big picture, like how much is on the table from a policy standpoint in this world of permeable, increased permeability, or I guess being thoughtful about future development that might work against the need for permeability. Is this the big area of mitigation potential, or is it kind of interesting but small potatoes?
Well, it's a factor, and there's a lot of development has already occurred in Boulder, and probably goes beyond what we can really cover here. But as we're having those policy discussions and thinking about city code and stuff, I think that's probably the time to bring that up.
Okay. Thank you so much, Joe and Debbie and everybody. I don't have any more questions, but maybe if I can, just to say an observation I have is it feels to me like there's some interesting potential for discussion in this space that touches different departments. I mean, obviously transportation talked about. So anyway, I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
So thank you so much. And I see Councilwoman, Council Member Folkert's hand up. Lauren, hello.
Thanks, Taisha. Sorry, Council Member Adams. You're so formal. I was wondering, so we were talking about this taking, having projects that span 35 to 50 years, depending on how we fund this. When those projects are complete, what do we anticipate in terms of flood risk in the city? Like, when all of those projects are complete, will all of the buildings in our community be outside of the 100-year floodplain? Or what level of protection are we anticipating from the culmination of all of those projects?
A really quick answer is because of the level of development that has already occurred, it's going to vary. And 100-year flood protection is the regulatory standard at the moment. The whole industry is thinking about climate change and looking at those things. But there's been so much development and encroachment on the floodplains already that some of the drainages are not going to be able to get near that. And so that's why in our comprehensive flood plan, one of the goals was to strive for the highest level of flood protection that's practical and feasible. That if there's already a ton of properties in there, kind of working with the local watershed and drainage and with the community to determine what can be done is where we're at.
Thank you.
Other questions for this team, for this section? Seeing and hearing none, we can go ahead, Joe, and bring up Angela Rego.
Yeah, and I might just start us out here. So the next part of our agenda, we have about 5 slides, if I counted them correctly, and we're going to talk about community outreach. And Angela is going to talk about the mechanics of our approach and the different ways we try to connect with the community. But before doing so, I just wanted to again speak to our philosophy, or really the style that we're trying to employ in the way we're engaging with the community. And we do understand, because of the level of development that's occurred, that these projects can be impactful, and our Boulder and our community values around open space and the environment are really an important theme. And so we have a team that's committed to working with the community and trying to show humility and compassion and empathy for those impacts. And we're also committed to our racial equity goals. And I would say we're still on our learning curve, and we're still improving as a department in the work we do as we try to accomplish that. But we definitely want these projects and community discussions to be accessible to everyone, not just those who can easily access the city. So I might leave it at that and turn it over to Angela.
Angela, I'm sorry, you're muted.
Thanks, Nuria. Thanks, Joe. Good evening, Council. So my name is Angela Rego, and I work with the Communication and Engagement Department, supporting the flood and stormwater group. Kristen, can you go to the next slide, please? So we all know the Boulder engagement spectrum, but I want to remember everybody, like for our CFS, we involve and collaborate with the community using a working group and community connectors for higher engagement. Now, our projects are in the design and construction phase, so we inform, consult, and involve property owners and community members. Now, our approach. So, equity and transparency, that's pretty important. So equity is a key component in how the utility department prioritize projects, engaging with community members one-on-one, promoting language access, and offering interpretation help us communicate clearly. We can connect with underserved communities, residing in manufactured home communities, and among renters. Then the education piece, that's our major goal this year, developing various communication channels, including videos, paper materials, one-on-one conversations, and presentations. We move into the identify and engage key stakeholders. So identify key organizations, community leaders, and groups to collaborate in creating significant partnerships and fostering trust. The most important for us is communicate concise and clear. So empowering our community through clear and concise communication. Next, so our tactics. We're gonna start with digital. So our website features user-friendly navigation and communication styles that are clear and easily understandable. The city's calendar and social media serve as tools to provide the latest events and information. Collaboration with local news outlets are key partnerships to enhance the outreach. Then we move into physical. We utilize bilingual materials, mailing, and flyers. branding our materials to ensure easy recognition in our projects, offering QR codes for easy access to our websites, meetings, and engagement tools. Then we go to in-person. So we have open office hours that provide a welcoming space for community members to engage in open conversations, meet our project managers, and ask questions. Community meetings serve to inform and update community members, offering an opportunity for questions. We compile these answers into FAQs on our project website. Alliances. So we create alliances with partner organizations such as Boulder Housing Partners, Central Amistad, and others. And through our community connectors, we elevate underrepresented voices and build trust. So for more information, please visit our boulderfloodinfo.net. And then I'm going to hand this to Joe. Thank you.
Thank you. And that brings us to our second question. And as I said in my introductory remarks, having an opportunity to check in with City Council when there's not a big decision in the meeting on one of our projects, and just talk about the various ways that we're trying to reach the public and have outreach. Just thought it was a good opportunity to discuss that with council and see if you have feedback or thoughts on what we're doing or what you'd like us to be doing.
So, thank you so much. And thank you, Angela, for that wonderful presentation. I see Council Member Weiner's hand up. Tara, good evening. Bring it on in.
Hello. Hi, Joe,
Hello.
Angela, and Brandon, and probably other people too who I missed. But so my question is, it's really, as it's actually a comment first, it's really difficult when it comes to community engagement and flood mitigation, I found out the hard way. But we did learn a lot from some previous projects, and I'm wondering, when it comes to Gregory Creek, we've also already seen a bunch of emails from people that live near there asking, well, can neighbors see drawings and plans? What happened in 2015? Why were things discarded? And then, can interested parties obtain current plans before the March open house? So I guess when it comes to community engagement, so we don't have the same things happen again, what are your plans for Greg? When you say we have community engagement, do you mean that the public can weigh in on how you're going to do flood, how are you going to do flood mitigation, and or are you saying that you're just going to give them a presentation on what you plan to do? That's, I guess the question is because managing expectations of community members is an important part. So I'm just curious what you learned from our last go round and what your plans are for Gregory Creek. And by the way, thank you for all the wonderful work you do. You know, I'm a big fan of yours, Paul.
Yeah, thank you for that. I might start, and maybe with specific plans on Gregory Creek, I can get some assistance from the team here. But I think in one of the earlier slides, Kristen talked about the kind of the life cycle of these projects and the mapping studies and the mitigation plans, and then design and construction. And it depends on what stage we're at. And it's really in the mitigation planning stage when we're looking at alternatives. And there often are different ways to manage within a creek or a drainage, and different approaches that we can use. There also, however, are some instances where there are boundary conditions, so to speak, and things where we have to be really clear with the community that there are limits to the alternatives we can look at. And just some simple things, and I don't mean this sarcastically, but the water has to flow downhill. And there might be a preference for it to go a different direction and not impact a certain area or certain set of properties. And there are limits to what we can do. It generally has to follow the valleys, and we may have some options within that valley. So trying to be clear with the public and open about those boundary conditions. I think we're learning that. And I actually feel like talking about the way we engage with the community, even on some of these intense recent ones, we've gotten feedback sometimes from the people who oppose what we're doing, that they do see that we're trying and we're trying to work with them. So I think it's having an effect. As far as specific plans on Gregory Creek, that's pretty far along in its process, and already had a mitigation plan in 2015 where the alternatives analyses were done. And so we're more at the stage of construction planning and working with individual property owners about easements and things like that, and where we might have options on a specific property. I know Angela and Kristen have recently had office hours with the community on that project a couple of times here recently, I believe, but I'm not sure, Brandon or Kristen, if you have upcoming things in mind. I might give them a second to weigh in.
Yeah, Joe, I can probably just help a little bit. And
Sure.
Good evening, council. I'm Brandon Coleman. I'm the engineering manager with Storm Flood Utility. And just want to flag, we're super excited to have Angela as a utilities. We do a lot more community engagement and outreach than other typical utilities, and she's already helped us to get light years ahead of where we were, because we are engineers. We're very technical focused. We always don't know the best ways to inform the community, like with Gregory Canyon Creek. So she mentioned some of the things she's doing. So a community meeting for Gregory Canyon Creek. We're also holding office hours where you can come in and meet staff and ask specific questions. So if you do have specific questions on the design, and then she's also a great point of contact for the community to get the right people in touch with them. So Angela has helped shape our outreach in just the short time she's been here, and we're really glad to have her. And I think she's only going to help us improve in the years coming on how we outreach the community and really inform them about what's happening, and also get them the information that they need.
Great. And second and last question, and this is for both of you probably. When it comes to stakeholders, the people that live in the affected area believe they're the biggest stakeholders. So if you remember, that's because it affects their property. Yeah. And if you remember one meeting we were at, Brandon, people were upset because they didn't get, like, should we have gone door to door? Should we have, what could we have done more of? How do you think we're doing now since that happened? Do you think we've improved in that? Or I feel like we have, because we've gotten compliments, as Joe said, but I just was checking in with you.
Right.
Yeah, I might.
Yeah, go ahead, Joe. Sorry.
Brandon, if I can start, and I know the group that Tara is talking about, and understandable concerns. And so had a small group meeting that Councilmember Weiner attended with us, and really tried to have some open discussions about what some of those boundary conditions were. And I felt like we had a positive discussion. But it's also important for us, when we think about equity, that we are communicating with the whole watershed, or the whole part of the community that is going to be potentially benefit or be impacted by a project. And so on that same project, kind of pulling back and going more globally, we also had a community meeting in November of last year. And it really bums me out, but it's sometimes hard to get people excited about utilities projects. And
I'm excited.
and we sometimes have really small numbers of participation. So that particular meeting that I'm talking about, it was for the whole watershed, and there were 100 people there, which is a pretty big turnout for our stuff, and like 60 of them in person, and the balance of them online. And I thought we had a really good conversation. So I think I just reiterate what Brandon said. Having Angela on board, having a position dedicated in our communications department, but working with us as a part of our team and our family that does the flood projects is key.
You,
I just want to
Sarah,
thank
you had one more question, I thought? You said it was the last of
didn't.
two of, you had
Nah.
one.
Now,
No,
I
all
just wanted
right.
to say, Joe and Brandon, that I always love to hear your perspective, especially because even though it does affect those, reminding me that although it does affect those specific stakeholders that have property there, it also flood mitigation affects everybody in the entire watershed. And I think that's often we forget about that. So thank you so much for reminding me and from reminding the community about that.
Yes, and just quickly, one of the slides that Kristen showed with the cars up to the windshield in water in Broadway, that's all part of that system. And the stormwater infrastructure around the hospital and the Ideal Market is not adequate, but there has to be a place for that water to go. And so it's a whole system that we need to develop. And I'm hearing from my team that I misspoke on the number. There were 163 people at the meeting. So we didn't do it justice.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. I see Mayor Pro Tem's hand up. Nicole.
Thank you. I just have two, what I think will be relatively quick questions. One is just in the alliances section. There was, Angela, you mentioned, and thank you for the great presentation. You mentioned that the community connectors are one of those ally groups. And I was wondering if that also includes the emergency response connectors as well, or just the community connectors?
I may ask Angela for help on that one. And if she's not aware, we may have to get back to you.
So I used to be a community connector, so I know what you're talking about, the emergency connector. So as I mentioned before, this year my main goal is to develop like an education plan and collaborate with them because they're our main, contact for our communities. So the city is big and they do an amazing job. So working with them is like a key element for me to keep those relationships, to, they able to talk in Spanish or Nepali. We have a lot of underserved communities where the language access is not there yet. We have the tool, but the easiest way to access to those communities is through the community connectors. And, I worked with them really close before, so I have a really good relationship and I want to really work with them together and, make this happen, like make the equity piece a main goal and the educational piece like a real commitment.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate that and see that very much in the plans and everything you presented to us tonight. So thank you. That actually leads perfectly into my next question, which I think again is another question for you, Angela. Is there anything that we can do to help help elevate this, especially as you're focusing on education this year? Is there anything that council can do to help you advance the education and work you're trying to do?
For sure, like your support is always important. And, we trying to work together with different organizations. That we have really amazing organizations in the city, So if you have ideas, if you have a contact, just refer to me and I will make that happen. I know a few ones like Centro Amistad, if Boulder Housing, but if you think about something or I'm missing something, thank you. I will appreciate any referral.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does any other council member have questions? I do have a couple, but want to hold space for those who may have additional questions. for this wonderful team? All right. Seeing none, just want to moments of start off with appreciations for the incredible multifaceted outreach attempts and yeah, just was very excited to see hybrid meetings, email, in-person office hours, some of the other components that had been discussed as well. I did have a question though about renters, knowing that the majority of our city are renters, and oftentimes a lot of this type of information tends to go to the homeowner or landowner. And so just wondering how our renters engaged in this work and getting updates around preparedness and just, general communications about this. Yeah, I'll just start with that one.
Do you want me to answer that, Joe?
Yes, that'd be great.
So I've been having communication with Boulder Housing Partners. I used to work with them, so I have a really good relationship, and they're the housing authority, they're one piece of the whole puzzle. But my main goal is to educate people about how they need to have insurance, because if any event, the most vulnerable and underserved communities are the ones that suffer most. If you're wealthy, you can recover. Versus if you don't have all those resources, it's more difficult. So just, coming out to the community, have education, start dialogues, referring, maybe giving resources, how, start putting that little seed in everybody's head. And sometimes people don't understand what we're doing, but this is for everybody's safety. So if people start to understand, it's not only about, little things here and there, if you're aware. And I know at this point we have a lot of people that they're coming from Venezuela too, and they're living out there. And so it's how we as community come together and start to be, working together, but also be aware about the resources we can offer.
No. Absolutely, and thank you so much. I would offer though that there is a large middle income renting population in our city, and so I would recommend again, I'm sure we already have relationships with the Boulder Area Rental Housing Association, but would love to make sure that those folks are also engaged in this conversation, as well as just maybe even some non-traditional ways, like some of our outdoor recreation programs, and just thinking intersectionally about where are these folks currently going to be, and I think certainly our incredible park system is one of, as well as our rec centers is another way that we can potentially meet those folks. So I really appreciate that. So that's actually the only question that I had on this section. I want to hold space for any other questions before we let this incredible team go. All right. I did have one more question around intersectionality. So just recognizing that, and it's so important that we are using the racial equity tool. And I always just like to remind folks the diversity within the diversity of the racial diaspora, and recognize that there are Black people with disabilities, and right. And so how do we also make sure that, people with disabilities and some, and many of the other intersectional marginalized identities are also being considered in this incredible work. And so again, I know the team is already thinking about it. I just wanted to make sure that we were specifically lifting that up, recognizing that race is an incredible and credible evidence-based indicator, and there's also significant diversity within the diversity of that racial identity. And so, and there's oftentimes disproportionalities within one racial identity based on the intersecting marginalized identity that individual may face. Alas, seeing no other hands up, I am ready for the I would like to thank the incredible team, Joe, Anhala, and just want to make sure, is there another section of this? There is, and I think we are ready to go to the next section.
We are ready to go to the next section, and just on that last point, I mentioned we're on our learning curve, and every department has a stake in this, and we're all learning together as an organization. And just as we went through the comprehensive flood plan, and we were feeling good about employing the instrument and the way we were going about things, but we also learned from it and got some feedback as we went. We had some things translated and heard feedback that, well, some of this technical stuff that you're talking about, if you do a direct translation, it's really hard to understand. And so talking, just a simple thing like talking to the translator before the meeting and briefing them on what we're going to be talking about can make all the difference. So
I
a
definitely
lesson learned
appreciate
there.
that reminder. I definitely
Yeah.
appreciate that reminder, and it makes me think of the cultural competence continuum. And the last part of that continuum is cultural proficiency. And I always like, what do you mean? You can't be proficient, but in it, the description, it says it is a continuum. You're always going to have to, as your understanding, awareness, skills grow, so too does your understanding, and then your actions align with that. So I definitely appreciate that continuous improvement model, and excited for the next section.
Yeah, so the last section, and we're tracking the time here, and I think we're doing well. And the last section is the project updates, and you'll hear about just a few of our projects, and referring kind of back to the team that we introduced at the start. There's a lot more going on. There's work is getting done throughout town, throughout the city, and one of the themes from our comprehensive flood plan was to do more projects faster. And we go through that cycle, and we have a lot of mapping and planning studies, and it can feel like nothing is getting constructed or built, but it's happening, and there are projects. So Kristen will start us off on this section, and we'll do a few slides here, and then I will wrap us up. Kristen.
Thanks, Joe. All right. So I'll go through some of our key active flood mitigation projects, and I'll start with the Upper Goose and 2 Mile Canyon Creek project, or for short, UGT. Just to give some context of the location, the mitigation plan starts on the western edge of the city and continues to Folsom Street. The plan involves a combination of above ground channels and buried pipes to safely convey water and remove properties from the floodplain. To give clarity around the removed properties from the floodplain, when we say that, we're not physically removing properties. Our proposed mitigation would reduce the extent of the floodplain boundary such that properties are no longer within that boundary. The mitigation plan was approved by City Council in May of 2023, and design efforts are anticipated to begin early this year with a focus on conceptual design of the downstream reaches. We briefly already touched upon Gregory Canyon Creek, but I can give some historical context to the project as well. The Gregory Canyon Creek is a steep and narrow drainage way that has limited capacity to convey floodwaters from the Chautauqua area all the way down to its confluence with Boulder Creek. The mitigation plan was approved by City Council in December 2015 and was split in 2 phases. We are currently in phase 1, which includes mitigation between Arapahoe Avenue and Pennsylvania Avenue. And the confluence with Boulder Creek is at Arapahoe Avenue. Preliminary design was completed in 2021. However, due to COVID and staff turnover, we didn't resume design until late 2023, with construction anticipated to start at the end of 2025. Joe mentioned this already, but just to let everyone know again, I am the project manager for phase 1 of this project. And the last project we wanted to highlight tonight is the South Boulder Creek Flood Mitigation Project. This project is intended to protect life and safety by addressing flooding in areas known as the West Valley. The mitigation plan was approved by City Council in 2015 and includes 3 phases. The first phase, which is currently in design, is a regional detention facility upstream of US 36 on and near the property commonly referred to as CU South, and that's what we're showing in this rendition that's playing on the screen. Design will be completed this year and construction is anticipated to begin in 2025. I'm going to hand it over back to Joe to discuss upcoming processes for this project. Thank you.
Yeah, so in my introductory comments tonight, I mentioned the reason that we're having this study session on this date is because we do have some upcoming process coming up on one of our projects. It's the South Boulder Creek project, and it has been in the works for literally over a quarter of a century, and we've gone through a process of elimination and have been working for the last few years on a single alternative, and there are 2 remaining city public process steps for this flood mitigation project. The primary one involves the transfer of property between 2 of our city departments, or the transfer of management control of about 2 acres of city open space to our utilities department for the mitigation plan. And on the slide that is on the screen here, you see that's US 36 as it leaves the southeast portion of Boulder and heads to Denver. There's a blue outline there, and that is the roughly 2 acres of city open space. So it's property that's already a city asset, and it's owned by the city. And so I mentioned the land transfer between departments, and that involves what's called a disposal. And unlike other city-owned property, open space land has very specific uses and procedural requirements that are spelled out in our city charter. And an open space disposal requires formal approval by a majority vote of both the Open Space Board of Trustees and City Council. So this will be coming to City Council in a joint study session between the Open Space Board and Council in February, and then the board will have its own deliberation in March, followed by a council deliberation. And I said a joint study session. It's actually a joint public hearing. I said that incorrectly. And so I mentioned 2 process steps. The other process step involves an annexation of essentially the same property. The blue outline here shows the amount that is needed once the flood project features are in place. That outline surrounds those features that will be there for the long term. There's also temporary construction impacts that'll be adjacent to that. So the acreage essentially doubles and will be about 4 acres. And so that will be annexed into the city. And the reason that we're doing that is that the annexation will reduce jurisdictional complexities. We'll have all of our features of the flood project within city boundaries. That shape that's shown on the screen is already adjacent to city property, so we'll just be adding that to it. And if you're thinking about this project and the word annexation comes up, that probably strikes fear into people's hearts, and this is a different creature than what we were talking about a couple of years ago with the CU South annexation process. Because of the ownership characteristics of the property, it's different than that, and it's a much simpler process. And this property would not be available for services or development in the future. It's just merely getting our flood project components within the city limits. And I will, so we'll have packet materials coming to City Council here soon with information on that process and the joint public hearing in February. We did provide a link in the study session memo for tonight to an open space board packet that has a lot of detailed information on the history and the mechanics of how this all works. So if anyone wants a sneak preview, the information is there and available. And I believe that brings us to our last question for council tonight. And so if you have questions or would like to discuss with us any of the updates on the projects, we're happy to do that.
See, Councilmember Marquis's hand up. Hello, Tina.
Hi. Thank you for all of this. And I do have a quick question about the South Boulder area. And it really goes back to some of the first comments at the beginning about how the effects of urbanization and development are creating higher flood risks. And now we're retrofitting.
Yes.
In the CU South, we are also going to be doing development of dormitory or student housing. Is the project right now designed to mitigate any impacts from the new development while simultaneously mitigating impacts for the CU South area where we've already seen issues, if that makes sense?
It totally makes sense. And the thing that's different now is, and just a quick touch on history, the city of Boulder was developed before modern floodplain regulations, which came into play in the 70s. And so that's where the retrofitting happens. There were already things built in what became the 100-year floodplain when that regulatory part came to light. That is now established. So everything that CU builds will have, and because they're part of the city and subject to our regulations, it will be out of the floodplain. And so it won't provide additional encroachment that we'll have to deal with later, because it's new development that's being done under modern regulations.
Thank you so much. Tina, any follow-ups on that? Seeing none. Mark?
All right, just
Welcome
again,
back.
just one quick question. Is it too early for CU to have done any planning itself that they have discussed with you in terms of how they're going to develop the property, in what order, et cetera?
Yeah, sure. So it's a great question. And we are now meeting regularly with the university. And for members of the public who might be new to this and following, we had the annexation of CU's property that is part of this whole thing was done in 2021. And there's a really lengthy agreement that is established with that. And so we're now meeting regularly with the university. Part of what has to happen in order for this project to go to construction is some of the assets that the university has and some of the agreement points that we made have to come to light. Part of the university owns 308 acres out there, and a big portion of their land will be coming over to the city, as well as water rights. And then we have to build into the project the connections that they will need for our utilities. So we're really focused on that right now. And we haven't talked a lot about their future plans, but can follow up if I have this wrong, but I don't think they have gone a lot farther with that. And they're just focused on the mechanics of what's happening for the flood project.
Given the complexity of our contractual arrangements for this piece of property and its great significance for the community, would it be appropriate if I suggested periodic updates to council just to let us know what's going on, and both in terms of the approval process for the dam itself and the development process with respect to CU, what they're doing, what they're thinking. There was a lot of controversy over this project, and we have approved it, and it's going forward. But I think people should still have the opportunity to hear and understand what it is that is going on. And it's, you know, I'm not suggesting a weekly newsletter, but some sort of periodic updating. And I think this council, being so largely new, would benefit from that as well, because we are ultimately going to be asked questions by our constituents as to what's going on. And it would be good if we knew.
Yeah, for sure. And we are committed. We just went through the engagement section, and particularly on this project, to keeping our website up to date with the activities that are going on. We can absolutely share that with council when there are key updates or milestones that we reach. And in going back to the annexation agreement, the elements of that that are relevant to the flood project is really a pretty small subset of the agreement. And a big portion of it has to do, the big portion of the agreement has to do with their future development, and they're bound to certain transportation aspects and building restrictions. And so fortunately, in the year here that we have going through design and leading up to construction, the utilities flood project team, we're not having to contend with that. But what I can commit to, I do know we have a meeting coming up soon here with the university, is inquiring about their future plans and the timing, and reporting back soon.
Yeah, I think that would all be interesting information to us, as well as information from your department. You know, I recall there were a plethora of approvals that we had to obtain from various agencies. But if somebody were to ask me right now, where do we stand on that, I would not be able to answer the question. You can, and perhaps, you know, every once in a while you can tell us how that process is going. Are we running into roadblocks, et cetera?
Yeah, for sure. And there are a number of agencies that we need permits for. And the team, I can just quickly speak to that in general. The team has really been focusing on the aspect of design that has to do with the open space disposal and refining the footprint of the project, so we knew exactly what element of property that we're talking about. We've been focused on that, and that now sets us up to submit all those permit applications. We're in the time frame of kind of the last year that we were planning for the design and permitting, which is a decent place to be at this stage of a project. And we'll be submitting those all in the next few months and obtaining them before we do construction. Some of them, by design, don't come out till very late in the process, like the state engineer's approval and things like that. So it'll be happening throughout this year.
And my last question on this is, at what point will you be able to basically upgrade your cost estimates for the project? You know, we've used some rather round numbers, and I know we're not going to have a full, you know, biddable construction document yet, but you know, at some point we'll need to know how much this thing actually costs, and as you're updating your information and knowledge, that would also be good for us to know.
Yeah, for sure. I ask Brandon that question every week, and but one update I can give on that is, in the last year here, we added a construction contractor to the team to look at the design and provide that perspective. And we actually had them study our existing cost estimate and go through it. And I would say it's more established than just round numbers. And they have validated for us that they feel like we have a sound estimate. The 60% design will be coming out here within the next month or so, and so we'll probably get a more formalized number then, but we're not expecting big changes at this point.
Well, I await that estimate with bated breath. Thanks. Thanks, Joe.
Me too.
Appreciate it.
Thank you, Mark. I see Mayor Pro Tem Nicole.
Thank you. And I just had a couple follow-ups to Councilmember Wallach's comments there. One is that this is something the Mile High Flood District does as well, as they will increase the money that they are giving to us when project costs increases from time to time. So we just approved some last week at our meeting as well. So I think that when things increase, the money for it comes in from, or increases, can increase from other sources too. And then the other thing I was just going to offer is some of the folks in my neighborhood have been asking recently about what's happening at CU South, what the timeline is. And I actually sent them to the website, and I think the website is a really good source for kind of current information. So thank you, Joe and your team, for updating the website. But I think that's something we all can, the more we can try to push that out to the community as a place where if you have, internet access and you're able to go to the website and read or hear about it, it's a good place to stay up to date on projects. And it seems, at least when I check in, I've probably checked in on the website maybe 3 times in the last year or so. And every time it feels like the information is pretty fresh and up to date. So thank you for what you're doing. I feel like it's a really good resource there. And that's maybe something we can offer as council members, is just try to encourage people to go there and see where they can find updates. And that's true for all of our flood mitigation projects, which I've really appreciated.
Thank you, Mayor Pro Tem. Pat.
Thanks, Stacia. Yeah, I kind of want to pull on that thread a little bit more. I appreciate where Mark was going with regards to those check-ins. I get a little concerned with a project of this scope. There are long periods of time, Joe, right, where there really isn't that much happening, and you're kind of waiting and waiting for others. And so I don't want to create an expectation of check-ins where we ask for a check-in and your answer is still waiting and we're working on it. So I want to make sure that they're at those proper inflection points, like, hey, 60% design. That's when we start talking disposal, good check-in. So I just want to make sure we're not overdoing, because I love to just sort of see you and your team just put your heads down and do the great work that you're doing, and not have us kind of get in the way by having you have to come up and tell us some of the stuff that's pretty much a priori in a lot of ways. So in any event, I just want to make sure we don't pull the pendulum a little too far in one direction on the check-ins, but I want to stick to those major milestones is probably pretty healthy.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks for that, Matt. And I think as a city team, we have various tools that we can use to get information out, the website being one. Sometimes we'll do a heads up or a hotline post. So it becomes more of a work item for the team if we're coming to council with memos and presentations frequently. But I think there's other ways to get the information out.
Thank you so much. Any additional questions from council on this topic? And we've reached the end of my wait time. Thank you so much, Joe and team, for this wonderful update, critical conversation and topic, obviously. I also appreciated Tina's reminder of the community engagement continuum and the constant effort to move beyond inform and consult and really into that collaboration space, but also recognizing that there are limitations based on a variety of different issues, but it is in our ability to communicate those limitations and still allow for those areas where we can collaborate and empower to exist. So thank you so much for so much incredible work in so many different ways on an incredible topic. And without any closing comments.
Well, if I can just say thank you for the opportunity tonight. Great discussion with council. Really appreciate the preparation that our presenters did and our representatives from the Mile High Flood District for being with us tonight. So we'll look forward to checking back in with council on some of those upcoming process steps. And thanks for tonight.
Thank you. I want to lift up appreciation for the tours of South Boulder Creek. They were very, very helpful for us I know some council members were able to participate in hosting a variety of those, and as we think of additional community engagements, I think having those types of walkarounds and helping people to see what all the different maps look like in reality really does help to ground some of those pieces. So thank you so much for the field trip and that additional information. I know that's a huge time commitment for such a large chunk of staff, but it really does help to inform and having that technical opportunities really help to make the data that we are receiving that much more rich. So thank you so much.
Happy to do it.
Awesome. All right. So we are going to go ahead and pivot now to an update on state legislation and city plans and process for engaging in advocacy.
Thank you so much, Councilmember Adams. And to your last point on the previous item, I just want to appreciate all of council who's been able to make those tours, to continue to ask us for field trips and really go deep and go to places. I think staff enjoys them, but I also so agree with you, Councilmember Adams, that it makes a difference. Reading a memo is one thing, going to the place is a very different thing that adds dimension to the words that and the many words that often we give you all in our very lengthy memo. So just wanted to lift that up and appreciate that. Our next item, as you mentioned, is an update. We all know that there is a regular session going on, as we know, and there's a lot of interest in what is happening at the Capitol and how that impacts us. And while I know we've got some opportunities to think more deeply about our own policy statement, tonight we've got an update for our very own Chief Policy Advisor, Carl Castillo, on sort of all the support that he gives, but what we are hearing from our our current legislative session that is coming down the pike. So Carl, up to you.
Yeah, thank you, Nuria, and thank you, Councilmember Adams. I'm going to attempt to share my screen here and put up a slideshow, so give me one moment. Okay, can you all see and hear me okay?
I don't see your presentation. Do you have a presentation
Yes.
up?
It didn't pop up? Okay, let me,
No, it did not.
all right, my apologies.
Mm.
How about
Here
now?
it comes.
Great,
Here
great.
it is.
All right.
Though you were not in presentation mode, I'll just
I was
say.
going to
There
say,
you go.
there you are.
Yeah, great. Okay. One more thing. I appreciate your patience. Okay. Well, good evening, members of council. As Nuri said, I'm Carl Castillo with the city manager's office. And tonight I wanted to say just a few words about the process that the city uses for advocacy at the state capitol. I'll keep it short, out of respect for the fact that the majority of the council knows this very well, but I also want to make sure that we're doing what we can to bring our new council members up to speed with the process and make sure that if they have any questions, that this is a great opportunity to have that conversation. I'm also going to be speaking a little bit about how this process actually plays out with specific bills that we've actually taken positions on. And then finally, provide you a little bit of a forecast of what you can expect, bills that have not been introduced yet, but that we expect will be, and ones that we think are of particular interest to the city. Okay, so I think it's pretty obvious why we engage at the state capitol. Decisions get made or should be made, can be made, that impact us greatly. They can be towards our advantage or against our advantage. And unlike advocacy on ballot measures, which we are limited engaging on because of the Fair Campaign Practices Act, we can't use city resources on trying to impact candidates or ballot measures. We are absolutely permitted to advocate for changes at this on legislation. So that's what I'm going to be talking about tonight. By way of example of why it matters for us to get involved, I've listed here 6 examples of bills, or actually topics of legislation that we have significantly impacted just in the last 3 years. And the one that I'll call to your attention is the one that just passed last year, which expanded our municipal authority to use photo radar. And council, I think it was in the last month or two, actually passed a resolution to execute that authority so that we can now keep people safer on a lot of our arterial roads where we were not able to use photo radar in the past. So I'm going to shift over to the use of the policy statement. You all have seen this at a legislative breakfast. You all were given a copy of it. The policy statement is composed of principles, priorities, and positions. And the primary thing which I'll be speaking about are the positions, the 71 positions, which are broad enough to contain topics that we don't know exactly how they're going to be addressed as far as policy, but not so broad as to be meaningless. For example, we don't have one that says protect the environment. We also have examples of how that can play out. So we have lettered examples under most positions, explaining kind of a more detailed scenario of how we'd like the policy to be shaped. We do this because it helps to inform the city's advocacy. Otherwise, we'll be running the council and asking for direction every time a bill came out, and we wouldn't have the ability to act proactively prior to a bill being introduced. Having this really has been a big reason why Boulder has been successful and being so impactful at the state capitol, because we are able to move rapidly and be nimble and engage in the legislative process, which is really an hour by hour, day by day conversation that takes place during the 4 months of the legislative session. So while the policy statement is focused on beyond just state legislation, it focuses on administrative regulations, rules at the state, as well as federal rules or federal legislation, or even regional policies. I'm going to be focusing purely on state legislation because it is the beginning of that season, and that is where the policy statement is used perhaps in its most important way. So we adopted it in October. And we typically look for revisions at this time of the year. And the best practice, which has been incorporated by reference in the policy statement itself, is that if the council wants to make any changes, the ideal would be for them to suggest them, bring them forward to me. Certainly you can bring them forward today, but ideally, perhaps after this meeting, and before the next consideration, which is February 15th. And that is the meeting where we actually, at a formal business meeting, council will be allowed to consider any revisions. So I would encourage you over the next couple of weeks that if you have any changes you'd like to see, probably just call me or send me an email. I'm going to most likely convene council's intergovernmental affairs committee so that they can review those. And the benefit of having this process is that we can review it, we can do a staff analysis, and the committee can come back with a recommendation so that on February 15th, the council will have the benefit of not just different ideas that have been thrown about, but a recommendation from the committee on the 1, 2, 3, 4 changes that should be made to the policy statement. Of course, council can make whatever changes it likes, but we believe it's better informed by a deliberative process through the committee. So in terms of the actual application of the policy statement, we have to connect the dots. So we have a policy statement position, and then we have to say, well, how does that apply to a certain bill? Would council have anticipated supporting or opposing or amending a bill when they supported this particular position? Not the easiest task to divine what council had on their mind, not to mention the fact that council is made up of 9 different people, but that is my charge, and one that I am very humble and very appreciative of, and very respectful to never get ahead of council, So as I've said many times before, I do my best to be very conservative in interpreting council's policy statement position. And the goal is that we have a united, coordinated voice that reflects the council majority. And most often it's the unanimous council. So clearly the ideal is for us to be conveying a policy position that reflects the entire council, or at the very least, the majority. And in doing this, of course, what's really important is that council gets a lot of communication about the positions that we're taking. One of the things that I'm going to point you to and point the members of our community to is a website that it contains a variety of sources of information, including State Bill Colorado, our dossier, our report, where we track all the bills and we indicate whether we're supporting, opposing, and also how it connects to any policy statement position. So in other words, an explanation of why we're taking a position on it. And so that's a very important part of the communications that council receives and will continue to receive. There are other emails, there are other updates like tonight and again on February 15th. And of course with the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee. So the idea is that at any point, I am incorrect in conveying a position or even adopting a position that hasn't been conveyed, that you have the opportunity to correct, provide course correction. That isn't something that has happened often. It's pretty rare, but it's certainly something that has been done before, and it's not the end of the world, especially since a lot of times we've only adopted a position and not conveyed it to anybody. And if we're very active on it, we're probably pretty darn sure that council's aware of it and supportive. So council's Intergovernmental Affairs Committee is made up of 4 council members listed here. Like I said, they suggest revisions to the policy statement. They participate with staff to help develop strategies to advance or defeat legislation. And when legislation is introduced that is clearly of significant interest to the city and to council, and maybe there's a policy statement position that says something so close that would suggest that it's an easy yes or no, but it's just not clear enough. And or either because how it's written or because of the way the council discussion took place, that's when we will turn to the committee. And that is something that our council in the past has given the committee the authority to make those decisions when there is enough ambiguity. So who are the advocates? Who are the ones that really, once we've adopted a position that can actually start conveying our support or opposition or the more nuanced positions that we have? First and foremost, it is all of you as elected officials, the elected officials at the state capitol, of course, would like to hear from their counterparts at the city. You have the most political capital and credibility, so you are an important part of the team. And coordinating with you is something that I look forward to do. And again, I think of it as an honor. I also work very closely with the city departments. Very often we have departmental expertise that is of need. Let's say have somebody from water utilities or somebody who specializes on Vision Zero transportation projects, or chief of police. Very much the case that at meetings, testifying, sometimes they are the best ones that provide a technical level of a capacity and a credibility that's very useful. So that's part of the strategy on who we turn to and why we turn to. It's what's needed to get the bill across the line or to kill the bill or to make the change. What's the voice that's necessary? Of course, I'm part of that team as well, and I explain my coordination role. And occasionally I will testify as well. Generally speaking, that's if no one else is available. I want to make sure that the city's voice is heard, and I certainly attend a lot of meetings. And probably one of the biggest things I'm involved in is a lot of the intergovernmental coalition building to get many other entities to support or oppose along with us. And I'll talk more about that. Finally, we do hire headwater strategies. Here we have Adam Eichberg and Will Coyne. I believe you met Adam at our legislative breakfast. Will Coyne is the other co-founder of Headwater Strategies. two of the best lobbyists at the state capitol, and I say that with complete sincerity. Great people to work with. As I mentioned, in order to be effective, we have to work with our partners. We would need to elevate our voice by elevating the number of people that are concerned about the issue. So a big part of the work that we do is involve ourselves with coalitions. CC Force Yay, as many of you know, is a coalition that Boulder and Boulder County founded 4 or 5 years ago, and they are climate action advocates at the state capitol. And so our role with them is influential. Councilmember Benjamin is now the chair of the policy committee at CML. I'll say more about that as a really important partner. So I've just listed a few other partners here. I guess the last one I mentioned is the Northwest Mayors and Commissioners Coalition, which is a hugely important advocate for transportation, especially regional transportation goals that we have. I am calling to your attention the Colorado Municipal League because they are the big dogs in terms of the municipal advocacy world. They have a team of full-time lobbyists and attorneys that focus solely on protecting the municipal interests at the state capitol. They have a full-time presence there. So clearly they have more of an impact than we do. And they also focus on a much greater range of topics than we have the time or capacity to do. In many ways, our work is supplemental to what they do. Sometimes we're taking on issues that they, for whatever reason, it's not something that they're advocating on. Occasionally, there's an issue that we actually have a different view on. And clearly, there's the ones that are pretty important for us to have our own independent voice. If you haven't already, I think they automatically have signed you up for their State House report. But please do look towards that. And when you notice there's a discrepancy and that it reports a lot more than what we are reporting as your city staff, again, it's because sometimes we just yield a lot of those issues that are just such general municipal interests that we don't feel the need to get involved or certainly defer to CML. So that's why there is a difference, but that's an important source of information for you. So here is the website that I want to recommend that you look at if you haven't already. And for members of our public, it is www.bouldercolorado.gov/intergovernmental. And if you go to that site, you have a little jump to menu. And from there, you can see some really important things like our policy statement. You can see the State Bill Colorado reports, which identifies our positions on bills. You can link to the Colorado Municipal League's website to get the information on bills that they're working on. You can get information that links to the Colorado General Assembly, where you can get your own research if you choose to do that. And there's a lot of other important information. Okay, so kind of transitioning now to how do we use this policy statement? I have a few bills I want to just talk about and how we apply the policy statement to get to the result and the position that we have. So here we have a bill that was introduced 2 weeks ago, Senate Bill 036, which is imposing a fee on some of the most populous counties that varies based on the weight of the vehicle. And it is designed not to penalize owners of big vehicles, but to create a funding source that can be used for infrastructure improvements that help keep vulnerable road users safer. As it turns out, we had a position that completely anticipated this, and it says what you see here, essentially support the vulnerable road users protection fee, vulnerable road user protection fees. So a pretty clear indication that council wanted to support it. In fact, it was also one of council's 4 priorities. So we have adopted a position of support, and we're working on that, advocating, for example, the Northwest Mayors and Commissioners Coalition to get them to support it as well. Another bill that was introduced just 2 days ago, I believe, makes sure that adults, not just 18 to 21-year-olds, cannot use phones when they're driving unless it's a hands-free phone. Again, we have a policy statement position that directly provides us with information that council wants to support this. It's consistent with Vision Zero. And we've actually advocated for this for many years in the past, and it was even a council priority in at least one previous year. So it's been a tough one to pass We can talk more about it if you have any questions, but that's one that we adopt a position of support. Third example is a bill that I've never seen before, but a really interesting bill of racial equity study. This bill, Senate Bill 53, would require the State Historical Society to conduct a study to determine any historical and ongoing effects of slavery and subsequent systemic racism on Black Coloradoans that may be attributed to Colorado state policies, and to identify measures that are consistent with the Constitution to address those effects. Talks about who would be on that committee to steer it, and what kind of money would need to be raised for the study to take place. In this case, we don't have a policy statement position that would suggest support. We have a policy statement principle. We have 4 principles, and one of the principles is around racial equity. So working with our own racial equity staff to, I made the decision that this seems like something that the council would clearly support. And so adopt a position of support, thought that it was consistent with our policy statement principle. So we also take positions on some bills that have not been introduced, but that we know are coming forward, and we have to know enough about them. And so this is an example of just that. There is a bill that will be introduced by Representative Mobley, which would require municipalities in certain areas to allow accessory dwelling units to be approved administratively in those areas where single family homes are currently allowed. For the most part, it complies with our own rules, so it's an easy one, but not so easy in that it does say that you cannot require owner occupancy, nor can you require an extra parking space. I highlighted those 2 areas because those 2 sections, because that's an example of it differentiating from our own council ordinance. So even though we have a policy statement position, 22A, that says reduce the barriers to the development of accessory dwelling units and multiplexes, I sure didn't feel comfortable knowing where council stood on this. There's enough nuance here that I took it to the council's intergovernmental affairs committee, which met last Thursday, and they had a conversation which was informed by members of our planning staff that were there to explain more about how this legislation would play out. And with that information, and with the council direction that they had on 22A, they adopted a position of support if amended to ensure that the city may incentivize owner occupancy, long-term rental of ADUs, and support for intergenerational living arrangements. And they also would like to see that that kind of local program to incentivize those things would be eligible for the state's grant program that's being created. So I'll leave that as it is for now. Another position that we took is, and this is a much more straightforward one, is a bill will be introduced by Representative Kipp, which will allow local governments to have authority to regulate pesticides that they're currently denied. They've been preempted in Colorado for many years. This is another issue that we have advocated for many years. Council has identified as a priority. Council members have testified on it. So pretty easy to assume that council supports it. Plus, we have a policy statement position 52A that specifically indicates support for giving local governments the authority to regulate pesticides. I believe this year's effort may be more successful than the past because it is a more limited bill in terms of the scope of authority it would give to local governments. Focuses more on things that like signage and enforcing buffer zones around certain properties. So plus we have the governor's support on this one and his Department of Agriculture. That being said, it's still going to be a challenge, but we're hoping, and we're definitely going to be lobbying for it. Okay, so now shifting into the last of the 3 topics is just a heads up on things that we should expect to see at the State House that I believe are of great interest to you. The first one is of particular importance because it's a bill that it's a bill called transit-oriented communities, and it has to do with increasing the average zone density in transit-related areas. It's similar but different to what was in Senate Bill 213 last year, which we supported. So there is some expectations that we would continue to support it. And it is not a mandate. This is interesting, but it actually would deny cities that don't comply with their highway user trust funds allocations. So it's somewhere between an incentive and a mandate, incentive heavy, I guess you might say. Council's Intergovernmental Affairs Committee talked about this last Thursday. They had a lot of concerns, a lot of questions. This one really, they had a full entourage of transportation and planning experts. A lot of concerns about what kind of impacts this would have and what kind of changes it would require of the city and whether it was appropriate. They were not able to reach any position on this. I will say just quickly that since then, we've actually reviewed more closely what this bill would currently, as drafted, would require of cities like Boulder, or I should say more specifically, what it would require of Boulder. And it seems like it would not change our zoning. So in other words, we would have already met the minimum average zone housing density under our latest calculations. We do have a meeting with the governor's office tomorrow to go through the methodology to make sure that's the case. But obviously, if that is the case, then our concerns with this may be much less, and it's something that I will be bringing back to the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee to revisit with the new information. The one thing that I highlight is there is still something that's very different than what we currently provide for, which is the bill would require administrative approval for multifamily residential property developments on parcels that are 5 acres or less in size. I'm not a planner, so I don't understand the current process, but I understand there is a different development review process that is beyond administrative. And so this would be a change, and maybe one that is of too big of a concern for our city to support. So this is just a heads up. No position has been taken on it. We are very much engaged on it, and by that means understanding where they're going, helping them understand the impacts they could have on us, but not conveying any position of support or opposition. There's another bill, much less controversial, that would require regional housing assessments be conducted by the state and local governments to create their own regional housing plans. That should be introduced shortly. There's a bill that would prohibit occupancy limits based on familial relationships. Council has not given us any direction to engage on this one, other than, well, let's put it this way. I am engaging in it, and we have our planners engaging on it because we want to know what's going on, but we have no direction that would suggest the city would want to take a position for or against it. But nonetheless, we know that it's important to the city, so we are participating in the meetings to understand what the consequences could be. Similarly, there's a bill that would prohibit parking mandates. We have no direction from council that would speak towards this one way or another, but it is of course of great importance, and that completes, well, actually, so those are some of the major land use reform bills that are coming forward. There's two other that I guess would also, perhaps, I have this title, land use reform, affordable housing. It really should just be affordable housing. There is legislation that will come forward to address construction defects, the litigation, the concerns that developers have that it's too costly because they will be sued to build condos, and that the insurance that they have to pay for is too expensive. There is a bill out there that Senator Zenzinger is going to be introducing that would allow for some remedies outside the court system. Council has a rather vague policy statement position on this. It was intentionally vague because we know that details matter quite a bit on this. One thing that we don't want to do is deny our residents the consumer rights to pursue their interests in any defects that they may find in their own condo. So this is just a heads up that this is coming forward. There's also perhaps a little more straightforward, a bill that's going to come forward that would create new rights for local governments to purchase multifamily rental properties when they're put up for sale. If this apartment building that's put up for sale has an existing affordable deed restriction on it, then it would grant cities a right of first refusal to purchase it before. So basically, the owner would get this, create the terms But if the city met those terms, they would have the right of first refusal. If a apartment building was being sold that did not have affordable deed restrictions on it, the city would have a right of first offer. That's much less significant than a right of first refusal, but it at least allows the city an opportunity to be entertained as a future buyer. So that may be something of interest. We as the city supported this bill, a different version of it, a less ambitious version of it last session. It was vetoed by the governor. And so it is coming back, and it's coming back in a more narrow way, in a way that Representative Basenecker thinks might be more likely to succeed. So we have no position on either one of these bills that are stated, but ones that I expect we would want to engage on. So we'd be exploring this at a later date. Transit, some really significant stuff going on. I think you all heard Senator Fenberg at a legislative breakfast meeting saying that he's going to run a bill that would provide funding for the Front Range Passenger Rail District. Very important seed money, very important money that would demonstrate to Amtrak that we have a local interest and that we're serious, that we want them to come and select us as one of their expanded railroad corridors. The methodology for what that funding would look like and where it would come from is still being kept closely guarded. I don't know what it is right now, but I do know this is coming forward and it will be an important bill. Lastly, on transit, I just attended a meeting today with Representative Linstead and Senator Winter, where they unveiled legislation. And by the way, this I believe is semi-public. That's why I wouldn't otherwise be sharing information like this, because it was broad. It was a broad group of people that were included to the group. So as many of you know, there's concerns about RTD's current operations and current governance. So there's an effort to introduce a bill by these sponsors that would do a variety of things. It would, for one thing, it would study changing the size of the district. Apparently RTD is very unusual nationwide in how large of a district it covers. And they want to consider the ability to allow for other transit providers, perhaps having county or smaller entities providing transit at the local level, and RTD focusing on the regional aspect. Changing the decision-making process so that it aligns more with the DRCOG planning process, the Metro Vision process. Supporting training for transit operators. CDOT apparently has seen quite a bit of success in training transit operators, and I'd like to see that training be made available to RTD operators. Improving budget and reporting transparency. And then finally, but not least, board reform. So moving to professionalizing the board and revisiting its size. Right now, it's an all-elected board, very large board, and there is thought that perhaps there needs to be more expertise and maybe there should be more appointments made, and perhaps also a smaller size of the board. So this is of great importance to us because we all say we want more transit money, more money for buses, more routes restored. However, we also are often unlikely to say we're ready to give any of that money to RTD as it currently is structured. So the governor was quoted as saying not too long ago that this is much like what was done with CDOT beforehand, where there were some changes made and then the funding came. So in this case, this is a foundational change to the governance of RTD that could hopefully build the trust for constituents and members along the Front Range to agree to increase fees or taxes to support more transit service by RTD. I think this is my last slide on what to expect. Real quickly, hugely important clean energy plans that would require energy utilities to reach 100% carbon free or very close to by 2040. A bill that requires planning and incentives for investor-owned electric utilities to meet the demands of beneficial electrification needs of new development and of on-site solar. And finally, some natural gas system planning to avoid unnecessary utility investments in natural gas infrastructure where other energy sources exist. Happy to answer any questions on any of those, but I think with that, I will shift over and I'll just real quickly cover the 3 questions and then take down the PowerPoint slide so we all can see each other. The questions I have for you is, does council have any questions or comments about expectations of the Colorado legislature in 2024? Does council have any questions or concerns with the process the city uses to engage in state legislative advocacy? Does council wish to schedule its February 15th consideration of revisions to the policy statement as a public hearing? And on this one, I should explain. In the past, we have approached changes to the policy statement in different ways, and so council has an option how they want to proceed. We used to do it on their matters from council or matters from the city manager. However, back then there was also a vote was allowed, or that was back when council's structure allowed for a vote to be taken on decisions like that during matters. So that may or may not be an appropriate place to consider it. It could be certainly considered on consent. However, the problem there is that oftentimes when I come back to you for these revisions, I also have some policy updates, and sometimes we'll be asking for some direction on some of these bills as well. But that is also an option. And finally, it could be a public hearing. And the reason I'm bringing this to you, this is actually a matter that Council Agenda Committee specifically asked me to bring to you, so that you could direct how you'd like to have this brought forward on February 15th, or for that matter, if you feel like it needs to be brought at a different date. That is the end of my presentation. I'm going to stop sharing. And one last topic that I did not cover that I think is important. The issue of unified advocacy. Well, I guess bottom line, there's scenarios where an individual council member wants to testify. That is, of course, allowed. For that matter, it's a lot of employees. I mean, everybody has the First Amendment right. When you represent the city, our request and our more than a request of our staff, it's our expectations that it be a coordinated city position, so that our legislators or policymakers know that we have our act together, that we're coordinating, and that it does reflect the city. You, of course, have the ability to speak independently. I would always remind you that if your communication is using your title council member, it's probably questionable whether it'll be seen as entirely independent. But this all being said, sometimes it's entirely appropriate to speak independently as a council member if it is not inconsistent with council's policy statement. So as long as you're not putting council in a position where they're seeing mixed messages, and if the advocacy effort actually, let's just say a legislator says, I want you to come speak on your behalf. Well, then that's what's necessary to get the ball across the line. What we ask is that be coordinated with me, that it be reflective of council's policy statement direction. And if it's not, then it truly be a totally personal, independent communication. So I hope that's not too confusing, but thank you, Councilmember Adams, for your patience, and I would love to entertain any questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Carl. And I don't see any raised hands. Oh, here we go. Go ahead, Tara.
Just real quick, Carl, can you remind me what's the difference between support and actively support?
That's a great question, Councilmember Weiner. In fact, I don't think I've used that in the past. So, a very practical perspective, I actually have to, with the Secretary of State, identify which bills we are actively lobbying on. There is a lot of bills that we take positions on that we don't actually lobby on, either because the opportunity hasn't arisen, because the sponsors say, thank you very much, we don't need your help right now, or we don't have the capacity. But we still have a position there because it might become relevant and we might need to act on it. So a lot of times it'll be support or oppose. it just hasn't been conveyed yet. Actively means we are engaged in building a coalition and testifying and asking our legislators. And those are the ones that we would be recording in our Secretary of State filing.
Great. And can you tell me, remind me, or re-explain how we feel about that ADU bill? What I believe that there were questions about it, or we wanted to change some things. What were those things that we wanted to change?
Sure. And fair questions, is that it was a little bit confusing. Certainly we'll turn to the committee members to speak towards their amendment requests. But the way I understood it was twofold: is, okay, the bill says you can't require owner occupancy. Well, our city may still want to incentivize it. So an amendment that would clarify that the cities retain the ability to incentivize owner occupancy. The second component of that was Councilmember Folkerts brought up the issue that seems a little strange and rare, but apparently in some situations people build an ADU but don't actually rent it. So it doesn't really serve the community purpose that it was intended to. So we would like to incentivize actual occupancy. And along that line of thinking, we recognize, but of course, there's sometimes where you want to let your mother or family member use it, so you're not going to rent. So we combine that with or intergenerational living. But bottom line, the message there was it actually would be used. So that was part one of the amendment request. And the second, and by the way, I've already met with the sponsors or the governor's office since then, and they said, yes, you can do that. There's nothing in this bill that would prevent you. The second part would say, and the state is giving out grants to incentivize cities to encourage ADUs. Make this as one of the qualifying efforts that would allow us to be eligible for a grant. That latter part of it, that the feedback I got preliminarily was that may not be consistent with what they want, because they're saying don't require owner occupancy because they just want to build as many ADUs as possible. Supply side argument that you get this type of housing available and it provides greater options. So they think it's a little inconsistent for them to then incentivize an owner occupancy requirement and to grant the city some funding. So bottom line, what we've asked for, half of it is, it seems like it's in our grasp, the other half is we're not quite there yet.
Are you allowed to discuss, or is it inappropriate to tell me what the group felt, what the subcommittee felt about occupancy limits in the ADU?
We did not discuss it.
Okay.
Yep.
Tara, gonna go ahead and move on to Ryan.
Thank you, Carl. Thanks. This is really organized, and I'm excited about where you're going, where this is going in general. So I have two questions. The first one on the transit subject. I appreciate that you talked about the fundamental need for more transit service, and that the policies we're looking at right now are a stepping stone to that next step of actually more resources. Can I just ask you, do we have any anything, I don't know who it would be from the governor or others that are making any kind of commitment to really put some weight behind the idea that we should expect that that there's an actual movement towards that readiness to move towards that second step of funding, I guess, in the next session?
Yeah, so good question. In fact, it might not even have to wait till next session. I know that Coburg is leading an effort to use a legislative tool called the RTA, of Regional Transportation Authorities. Right now, cities can combine to raise money. Cities and counties can combine, they can create an RTA. It's kind of cumbersome because they all have to create an identical resolution and identify quite a bit of things about how it's going to be managed. What Coburg is suggesting is that DRCOG, who has an easier way to create an RTA, be given that authority, or not more than just give the authority, is to basically, through legislation, say that DRCOG shall create an RTA that covers the boundaries of all cities and counties within its jurisdiction. and that with it, it could raise transit money. So I can't get into the details mostly because I can't remember exactly how the RTA statute works. It's of course very exciting, the possibility of raising transit funding. But I think the challenge is going to be getting, first of all, this would actually require a vote of the people. It would be a tax increase. And so DRCOG would have to go refer a measure to the voters. And DRCOG doesn't have that ability. So it actually would be a citizen initiated measure that would say, voters, do you want to raise your taxes to support this RTA that DRCOG now has? The problem is, will the voters have had enough trust instilled in them on RTD, which is the likely recipient of a good share of this money, by the time they need to sign on to ballot measures or sign up to petitions? So I think it's going to be very tricky, but that's the only effort that I know that's underway to actually raise significant money for transit operations this year. As far as what would happen next year, there's nothing that I've heard specifically, but I think we could expect it if this RTD reform bill passes.
Okay, great. Thank you, Carl. My second and a final question is, I understand that the Governor Polis, is about ready to launch the second greenhouse gas, I think it's called a roadmap 2.0. This follows 2 years ago only he had the first GHG roadmap. And so this is committed to the state to a lot of changes and improvements. And so like now we have a big new one coming out, I think like within the next few weeks. And so this isn't legislation specifically, but I guess my thought is, number one, I would think a lot of us would consider Boulder as we should be leading the state. And so here we have an example of the governor really stepping up. And I guess the question to you is, does this signal to us anything that we should be raising our level of ambition in accordance with our values? Or maybe we have enough with the policy here, but or I don't know, anything else as far as the roadmap that's about to come out.
I will say that Council's policy statement position 2 speaks specifically about reducing statewide greenhouse gas emissions consistent with or greater than the state of Colorado's codified goals. It then goes on to specifically indicate our support for the greenhouse gas pollution reduction roadmap 2.0. Staff has certainly been involved in giving feedback. And this, as you said, it's not legislation, it's actually an executive order, I believe, or something similar to that. So we are certainly, as a city, we have direction from council that would suggest support for this. So I don't know if your question goes beyond that in terms of, what additional steps might be necessary.
Okay, thanks. I mean, it's sort of an exploratory question, like, does this give us any implications? But I guess one thing I hear you say is this is something that we inherently or intrinsically support. We don't need to actively do anything, but if council members were to weigh in and, in support of it individually, it would be consistent with our policy statement.
Yeah, and this goes back to the issue of individual versus collective lobbying. The important thing is that we coordinate. I mean, of course, like I said, council members can do anything on their entirely individual capacity. But if the goal is to represent the city's interests one way or another, even if you don't even know, even if you're not saying on behalf of the city of Boulder, but if you're trying to get the city's goals furthered, then we ask that you do coordinate with me. So there could be many ways where that could take place. And then, of course, if it's not in alignment with council's direction, then it looks different. We just need to, I would still appreciate getting a heads up, just because ideally we don't have, we're not surprised what one council member is doing or saying.
Great, thank you.
Any follow-ups, Ryan, on that one?
No, thanks.
All right. I had Mayor Pro Tem, but I see Tina's hand up first on the queue. So I'm going to go with Tina because she's first on my queue, if that's all right.
Is that okay, Nicole? Okay. So my first question is a really vague question. Do we have a process as a group to communicate what we're looking to do with the Boulder commissioners. Is that something that's described in our handbook or that I've missed?
You know, really interesting because up until the most recent revision of the policy statement, we did not talk about lobbying the commissioners or the university or the school district. They were primarily partners that we would join in to lobby the state. However, specifically on the issue of homelessness funding, our previous council did add a position about asking for support from the county for homelessness services. I can't remember the exact wording, but I see Councilmember Benjamin nodding his head, so he might have something to add at some point on that. But beyond that, we don't have like a policy agenda specifically towards like, here are the 10 things that we want from the county or something like that. It's not comprehensive in any way. It's just specific to that one issue.
Okay, thank you. And then are we answering all 3 questions on the last slide right now, or are we just doing them whatever we want?
Or if we kept it to the first one and then we can kind of move forward from there.
Okay.
If that's all right.
Yeah, that works. So I'll just ask
Awesome.
a couple other questions then that relate to the first. In the conversations about land use, have there been any discussions about disincentives or sticks to sprawl in the state?
Oh, interesting. None that come to mind under the current list of bills that are being considered. I'm sure if I was given a few more minutes, I would think of something that, generally speaking, that has been the case. But no, none that I think of with the current bills are about incentivizing smart growth. Yeah, actually, you know what? One thing I can say. So I think I mentioned that one of the carrots/sticks that's being considered is the 9 cities, the highway users trust fund allocation. Well, what I learned today is that that is being seen as part of a greater reform of HUTF allocations. Some people would say, many of us have often thought that the HUTF allocation incentivizes sprawl because one of the factors that it's based on is how many lane miles do you have. So in some ways, it perversely could give more money to cities that have more lane miles, when lane miles may not be what you want to reward. So to the extent that they are going to, through legislation, do some reform of how HUTF is allocated, that could very well be a disincentive to sprawl.
Okay. And then when you're calculating the looking at the calculation for what, whether we meet the density requirement that's based on structures, not on people in the transit bill. I remember during the IGA meeting that we can exempt certain areas like a school or a park. Are we able to exempt, and this is really based on our prior item today, watersheds and areas that are being used as permeable land for the purpose of flood mitigation? And also, are we able to get any carve outs, or have we thought about carve outs because we have a flood risk that can be partly offset by land use that may not look like development?
I don't know. I actually have a meeting with some of the folks working on this tomorrow, and I'll bring it up.
Okay. And then finally, I sometimes bring this up, but I am interested in measuring density differently than by units, but by the people that are housed. And the reason for that is I believe that we still need to be focusing on middle housing. So for me, it might be that 12 townhomes versus 40 one-bedroom units serve a similar amount of people, but townhomes sometimes can serve people who traditionally can't pay for rent, like children or people who a mother-in-law. So I'd love to see flexibility on how we measure density in terms of looking at the people served rather than the structures that are built. And that's just a thought that I've not heard that come up specifically, but I'm interested in that. And I think that's it.
Great, that's super helpful.
Awesome. Thank you, Tina. We have Mayor Pro Tem, Nicole.
Thank you, and sorry for the confusion with my hand going up and down. I was getting myself.
Oh, is that what it was? I was like, wait, how did this?
These questions, yeah. No. So yeah, I
Yes.
have got a question about our policy statement. And, you know, we were talking in the flood and stormwater update about the importance of language access and, you know, how critical that is to people's safety in our community. I think this also is something really in line with our racial equity goals. And, you know, one of the things that I noticed was our former council colleague and representative Junie Joseph, we didn't kind of highlight any of her bills here or, you know, any things that we're supporting there. And I was just curious about that because it's, you know, I think most of her bills this session are really focused on a lot of the most vulnerable people in our community, and the language access piece kind of triggered it for me because so many of her bills are focused on language access, like providing language access to children and families in the child welfare system, and making sure that the Department of Early Childhood Education is providing its licensing requirements and instructions and documents in people in prevalent languages. And so I'm just wondering if that, you know, Carl, to you is suggesting that maybe there's something we're missing in our policy statement around how we're kind of implementing some of the equity pieces, components. And I'm wondering if, and I know, you know, you said email suggestions, I will absolutely do that, but just if there, you know, is space for thinking about things like language access, right? That we would support language access, that we will support things that are, we know childcare is a huge issue in our community. We devoted some ARPA funds to it, you know, of things like childcare availability and access. If these are things that it's just suggesting we may need to add in to our policy statement.
Yeah, so totally appropriate. Thank you. I mean, I always welcome bringing to my attention bills that I may have missed. I do my best to review the bills, and sometimes I don't see the nexus. It could be something that's already totally in alignment with our racial equity principle. We supported a bill last year that had to do with language access, so we certainly have a precedent for doing that. And I know that we added new language on accessibility, and I'm not finding it at the moment. I think it's under Human Services, Human Rights. So that's one thing I'm going to look for to see whether there's some additional language that could support that. But point well taken.
Yeah, thank you. And I think with that accessibility, at least the way, I think that was one of the things I brought up. And I was thinking about it more in terms of kind of physical accessibility. But as we're having this conversation, it's occurring to me that accessibility does include language access as well. And so just thinking about how do we broaden these, you know, definitions of terms and things. So. But
Yeah,
thanks.
that's a
I'm
great
happy
point.
to follow up more and, you know, send.
Sure. I won't prolong the conversation, but you definitely
Thank you.
a lot of things here. Thank you.
Mayor Pro Temp want to definitely co-sign that, especially in light of the 600 families that we know are unhoused, and wanting to make sure that we're doing everything in every intersection to ensure that our families across the diversity within the diversity are able to access information. I see Matt's hand up.
Thanks, Taisha. Appreciate that. So touch on a couple things. So Tina asked the question about the county and our policy statement. And so Carl was right, kind of had that teed up. So in the Human Services and Human Rights section of our policy statement on page 17, item 23, you'll see in that sort of initial paragraph, that last sentence is, the city supports state and county action that funds and facilitates such efforts. Furthermore, it'll advocate for the following. So that's that qualifier word that used to not be in there, just would refer to the state. So we added the county as sort of a catch-all to say, yep, we're looking at you too, to be a partner and to move in these directions. So that was that little word choice change that Carl was referencing, but yeah, just so you have reference, it's right there in the policy statement. So don't know if that's sufficient enough where you were thinking, Tina, but just want to let you know that's where it is. If we are doing more, we do more. So I wanted to touch on the really question 3, I think this policy statement generally is in a great spot. I think largely we're in a really good space on it, and Carl and our team, Will and Adam, are doing a great job in getting us lined up and advocating. But with regards to sort of that third question, how
Sorry,
do we want to
Matt.
move? Yeah,
I'm
are we
sorry. I
answering
wanted to
questions?
try and, yeah, I thought we're trying to stick to one and just gathering all the expectations from anybody
Oh,
before we move on to the other
sure,
questions. Just wanted to wrap
not a
that up
problem.
before we go into process and some of the more logistical components of the
Fair point.
conversation, if that's okay.
Good.
I just had
Oh,
a
it's totally
few
okay.
comments that I
Go
wanted
for
to
it.
add on just for the expectation piece before, just to close out that conversation before we moved on, if that's all right. I just wanted to speak to the just a couple of topics that I know are of interest again for our community, and one of those is just around water. So although I appreciate this interest and the importance of clean energy, there is that intersection with water there naturally, but also just always interested in lifting up and seeing what we can continue to do legislatively to support our water plan and those kinds of things. So that's certainly an area of interest that I'd be curious about, considering our conversation around floods and floodwater, et cetera. Another area that I'm particularly interested in is the Colorado Outdoor Equity Fund, and that's a fund for that connects youth to nature-based experiences here in Colorado. And we actually have an organization called Right Relationship here in Boulder that is one of the grant recipients of that fund. They actually fund Indigenous Arapaho youth and elders to fund the nature-based experiences back with their ancestral and unceded lands. And so again, just curious about any movement in, I know there's been some requests around increasing the budget for that particular program. And again, I'm hopeful that more of city organizations access those funds because I know that there is some incredible work that's already happening, but I also understand the significant gaps that we have in meeting demand. So those are two areas. And then lastly, always interested in the any kind of renter. And I know we've made some there was that big housing bill obviously last year and affordable housing, but always keeping an eye on renters, considering again that the majority of the city of Boulder residents are actually renters. So and I see those multi-family rental properties, but again also interested in the other ways of rentals in our city. Thank you so much, and curious any feedback on those topics.
Well, they're all very appreciated. It's just important for me to know what matters to council, and that starts with knowing what matters to individual council members. Certainly the water issues, I do work closely with Joe Taducci and the city attorney's office on water, whether it's water quality, water supply. I'm missing other major areas, but certainly flood mitigation. But you're pointing out the Colorado Outdoor Equity Fund as being something that I want to look into that. That seems like something that could be very important for us to get behind. And as far as renters, we certainly have taken positions on support for renters just last session. And in fact, that bill that I mentioned by Representative Basenecker is in fact one that's related to that. There are two that have been introduced just today that I'm evaluating. So definitely be rest assured. And that's the kind of thing I may very well bring to the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, because sometimes they have unintended consequences. Sometimes it's like, elevating the support for the renters, but it's going to make it less likely that somebody's going to rent in the first place. So those are usually the tricky ones that I do bring to the committee and see what they think.
We appreciate that. Thank you so much. I'm going to transition actually back to Tina, because I believe you had a question about process in question number 2 before we circle back to Matt to kick us off on question number 3. Tina? Did you still have a question related?
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out, I think I might have answered it, but that we're going to have another opportunity to discuss our thoughts in a way where we decide if we're going to make changes to the policy principle in 2 weeks, and that we're going to take our thoughts and communicate them to Carl, and then he'll take them to the IGA, the IGA will make recommendations, and then we'll talk about that on February 15th. Because I think that was a question, but I wasn't sure. I'm fine with that.
Yeah, no, thank you, Councilmember Marquis. So yes, you will have an opportunity on February 15th, should you choose to keep that date, to revise your policy statement. Between now and then, any changes that you'd like to see, please do send them to me. I am actually looking to schedule a meeting with the committee to review those recommendations, so that they can then consider them, and then we can bring back a comprehensive package of recommended changes to the policy statement. I don't want to suggest that you all need to make a lot of changes, but if there's things that are missing, and you see as problematic, I guess what I'm drawing to your attention is if there are gaps that are preventing us from engaging on bills that you think are really important to the city, those are the situations where it's probably useful to amend the policy statement. Or of course, if you're a new council member and you just pointedly disagree with something that the previous council did, that's certainly an opportunity to suggest a change, and then we'll bring it to the committee. Doesn't mean that the council will make the change, but it's something that you all should have the ability to have that discussion. Does that make sense? Okay.
Kindly. And just point of clarification, when does the legislative term end-ish?
It's May
Ish.
7th-ish, May 7th-ish.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And I just asked because going back to just this process question around, and I know there's some fancy word for this, what I'm doing right now, I don't remember what it is, so if we can put it on a page. But I know we're having our retreat the first week of April, and I'm just curious if there would be a possibility, if there's something that comes up as a part of that retreat, if there's an opportunity to kind of revisit or refine. I know that'll be kind of mid or towards the end, but just curious, like how set, and if there's something, I don't know,
Yeah.
where there's flexibility there.
Well, it's up to council and council's agenda committee to decide at any point, if there's an important enough issue that you feel we're not engaging on or not engaging in correctly, you have that ability to provide the direction. We try to minimize disruption from your very busy schedule, but if come April, there is a major decision to be made, and the committee doesn't have enough information to go on, you certainly can do that. Whether the retreat would be an appropriate place, I would defer to Nuria.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Any other questions about process before we move on to whether we wish to have something in February 15th? I see Lauren's hand.
Thank you, Councilmember Adams. So Carl, I was hoping maybe you could just speak a little bit to why we time this the way we do in terms of, because for the most part, the previous council reviewed our current policy statement that we're using right now in our advocacy, and how that timing works and why we do it that way, and maybe some issues around trying to change, like if we make dramatic changes late in the game. Like if we were to support something and then choose to not support it, how does that affect our sort of long-term advocacy goals?
Well, I guess the short answer is if at any point you feel we are off course on any position on any bill, let me know immediately. I could very well, to be honest, it probably only takes one council member to tell me that there's a potential issue for me to stop advocating. Because I would assume, of course, that individual council member would have a sense of their colleagues' concerns as well. I guess practically speaking, I don't see that coming up. So what I'm asking for is, are there things that weren't anticipated that maybe should be addressed through a change to the policy statement? I don't necessarily see that the council has changed philosophically so much that there's going to be action on bills right now that are not representative of the council. So frankly, had there been a bigger change, this would be a much more challenging conversation. But maybe my read is wrong, but I don't think there was a gigantic change in terms of how this policy statement would have been approved.
Yeah, I don't think so either. I think I just wanted to sort of clarify that we are, some of this is a little bit guesswork. Like we're, at least on the committee, I feel like we are trying to anticipate what the majority of council thinks. And as we put forward views on bills. And so if there are concerns from other council members that around some of the complications of some of these things that we've discussed today, it might be helpful to have those conversations. So just with the IGA committee members so that we're properly informed and can make decisions going forward that don't, that really are representative of the entirety of the council body.
Yeah. And I certainly wouldn't want to have to use time today, but if at any point, in addition to changes to policy statement, if at any point you have concerns about positions we've taken or not taken, let me know. I can bring them forward to the committee.
Thanks.
Thank you, Lauren. Going to go ahead and circle back to Matt to bring us into our last question. Does council wish to schedule its February 15th consideration of revisions to the policy statement as a public hearing? Matt.
Thanks, Taisha, and sorry for jumping the gun earlier.
No
But yeah, so that last little talking point and that question by Lauren, I think was appropriate transition to this. So with regards to the 15th, the way I would suggest operating is if it seems that we're not making really substantive changes to this, then I don't think there's necessarily a need to have a public hearing. But if we are making substantive changes and it really calls out, hey, we're having a pivot here from what you may have otherwise previously read, then it maybe is substantive. And so I think it remains to be seen based on the suggestions that come about. But having a public hearing for the sake of it doesn't necessarily breed good engagement in that sense. So that would be sort of my recommendation, is to sort of let the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee kind of evaluate what changes come through, and if they're substantive, we do it. If they're not, we're not. So I don't know about predetermining it now. I based it on the substance of the changes that were being proposed, and furthermore, in terms of like how that propagates forward. I mean, Senate Bill 213 was one of the more chaotic experiences last session, right? Because it was being changed in so many dynamic ways up until the 11th hour. There were times where we like it, oh, we hate it. Now we like it, now we hate it. Right? I mean, it was all over the map. There's probably a little bit less of that chaos this time, so I don't see that sort of making some dramatic questions or having cold feet on certain things like maybe there was last session. So I agree with Lauren that there's just probably going to be a bit more consistency this cycle on a number of things. But we've seen 11th hour things come in plenty of times, Carl. So you never know when stuff just shows up randomly, and then we have to pivot and then adjust to it. So maybe we have to make a late call on that. So those are some thoughts on how we address the 15th and beyond.
Matt, I see Nicole, Mayor Pro Tem.
Thank you. And my question was, this is more a question for staff. I know that there are noticing requirements and things for public hearings. I am just wondering, what is that last date? Just so we kind of have it all on our radar. Like, when do we need to make that decision as to public hearing or not on the 15th?
I was gonna phone a friend and ask Teresa if she knew it, because I don't have the handbook in front of me.
Forgive me, I was having a little dinner. Um, typically we publish the agenda notices on the newspaper on Sunday. And so ideally we would have it in, and Alicia might be a good resource on when that deadline is to have it into the Daily Camera to make sure it's published on a Sunday. But approximately a week before.
And as we wait for Alicia to perhaps join in, I just mentioned it could be the option that we publish it as a public hearing, and then if it at a later date it becomes unnecessary, it's probably easier to move it to a matter, which I assume is what we would otherwise do it. Alicia, I hope I didn't jump forward too soon.
No, and thank you both for for asking the question. The actual dates that we need to be aware of is the public hearing sign-up form opens up the Friday before the meeting, right? So that would be the 9th. And so we would have the actual agenda published for that meeting on the 11th. So we would need to know by the 11th, I would say by the 9th or the 8th, to be totally clear if we're going to have a public hearing or not. Because once we open that form up, the public is going to be expecting to be able to speak on that matter. So if we're going to, like I said, if we're going to decide if it's a public hearing, we would need to do that before the 8th of February.
Okay,
And
thank you.
then from a procedural standpoint, should they, if the council is voting on this, then it would need to go under consent or a public hearing, not under matters. You could put it on consent and pull it for a discussion, though. That's an option as well.
Okay, thank you. And then if we were to pull it for discussion, though, that doesn't necessarily have time for people, like other than the people who had signed up for open comment, there wouldn't be a chance for comment if there were more significant changes. Okay, so, and I really don't have a preference. I would just go with whatever seems easiest from a staff perspective, because I know there's a lot you all are doing behind the scenes to get things ready.
I guess my thought is, while there may not be substantive changes to the policy statement that we need to consider by then, there could very well be a decision that council wants to make on a bill or two. But it's just a thought. It may very well be that your committee is able to resolve things. But that was my thinking. Anything else could certainly be under consent. An update could be written. So we certainly don't need to waste your time otherwise.
And if I may just want to just add something supplemental to that, even though we publish it on the 11th, that publication requirement for us to get it to the Daily Camera would be Thursday by 3 o'clock. So that would even make it even shorter of a time period for the 8th at 3 o'clock. So we would need to know by then.
Thank you so much. Tina.
Yeah, so just a clarifying question, just following up on what you just said, Carl, between, one thing is making revisions to the policy statement, which we may or may not need to do to be able to get through this session. It seems like that just, we can still make comments about individual bills. But what is, if you said that we were going to make a decision on a bill or two, what does that mean for us? Does that mean we vote to support to a bill, and how is that noticed? I'm thinking it would be different, or is it the same?
So Senate Bill 213 was just that case last year where council wanted to vote on it. So it was listed as an agenda item. I think there was more to, I think it was also the safe injection sites. So the public was made aware that there was a couple of bills that the council was going to be voting on. In that case, the committee did not feel that there was enough direction provided, and they wanted to bring it to the full council. So that's what I was envisioning could happen. But again, I don't know. I mean, that's the challenge, is do you want to hold a placeholder? The challenge with a placeholder is, are we creating expectations for a community that we are not going to fulfill? So I'm not quite sure what to recommend here.
And in that case, was there a public hearing? And
Yes.
Okay.
Any follow-up questions on that, Tina? All right, I see Teresa's hand up.
Thank you. Last year there was a public hearing, and that's certainly a tradition you can continue. I'll just note that there's no legal requirement for a public hearing. And so that is at council's discretion.
Thank you. Any other questions?
Can I colloquy on that? Can I colloquy on that?
Of course.
And Teresa, when you referenced that we had a public hearing last year, it was when we formally approved this policy statement that we're currently having. Is that correct? And that would have been this last fall. Is that correct?
I'll look to Carl, who might have a better recollection of when we held the public hearing and for what purpose.
So we certainly did a public hearing for the policy statement last October. but we also did one on the safe injection sites. We also did one on, and I think it was the same one for Senate Bill 213.
Yeah, and that was later in the spring, or late winter, spring,
Yes.
if I'm not recall,
That
further
was
the
not-
legislative session.
Yeah, that was probably April or March of last year.
Right. Okay, so yeah, just wanted to clarify.
Thank you, Matt. Ryan, you are up.
Thank you. On that same topic, I feel like it might be smart for us to look ahead and ask ourselves on what kinds of policies are we going to expect hearing before we get into that position. Carl, I don't know if you if you have any thoughts on principles for that, or if maybe you would disagree, but this feels to me like the kind of thing we could get pretty messy if there's mixed opinions on a policy, and now we're talking about it.
Yeah. Well, I believe that your committee and your policy statement as is, and your committee and I probably will have enough direction to address the bills that matter. And if something comes up that is totally, nobody knows what to do with, and it matters a lot to council, we'll have to deal with it then. But I do think I believe you all have enough faith in your intergovernmental affairs committee and me and your policy statement to address the things that we expect. But please correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay, but on the question of do we hold a public hearing?
Yeah.
Is that are you answering that? That's the question you're answering, that we.
Yeah, so that, as translating that to the public hearing is like, so that would mean that you wouldn't need the public hearing. Policy statement revisions could be done under consent. Updates could be done under matters, or in writing. So I'm thinking out loud here, and I'm waiting for someone else to chime in if they disagree, but that's certainly one way you could go.
I'm comfortable in principle with just fine, don't plan on doing public hearings, but I just thought if there's, so maybe that's the point, but I just think we ought to ideally come up with some shared sense of why would we want a public hearing before we get into it. So I'm fine with, we don't need public hearings if that's what the wisdom here believes.
You're Ryan. I see Nuria's hand up.
And thank you, Councilmember Adams. And mostly I just perhaps wanted a clarification because I think I'm hearing some consensus, but don't know yet. But wanted to just clarify with Carl, if an item were put, and maybe Teresa too, so let us know, Teresa, if an item were put on consent, pulled for discussion, and there were one particular item that someone wanted or the body wanted to speak on more, could the rest of could that item be pulled off of the policy statement and allow the conversation to continue on that particular item at a later date so that the policy statement is not per se laid up? I don't foresee that necessarily happening, but want to pose that question because that may ease some concerns that there's always opportunities.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And what I'm hearing, I am going to ask Teresa as well. So let's just say 6 changes to the policy statement are being made, but council cannot get consensus on one of them. Can council still support the policy statement revisions with 5 of the 6 and leave for another day the 6th change? Is that something that's possible, Teresa?
Yes, that certainly is possible. And council could decide to have a public hearing for the limited purpose of discussing XYZ.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Nuria?
Oh, good. Thank you.
All right. Any other questions for Carl? Mayor Pro Tem.
This is not so much a question for Carl, but I wanted to just put it in there. Dr. Cog has been getting some really great presentations on especially the housing and transportation related bills. And the recording from the last meeting is available online. If anybody is interested in diving a little more deeply, it is a nice presentation. You can hear some of the questions that came from some of the diverse communities in our region. It's just on the website. It's drcog.org/calendar. And if you go to the where am I? January 17th meeting, 6:30 p.m. when you'll find the recording in there. And it is very helpful. So I mentioned it to some of you. I just wanted to make sure you all got the information. Thank you for the time.
No problem, Mayor Pro Tem. Any other comments or questions for Carl? Right. Before we close, I also want to thank Joe and his team for a wonderful and meaningful and impactful tour of the SAMPS program, which is a safe and managed public spaces. And it was just, again, opportunities to see what the city does and to actually meet staff and the people impacted, and just the level of coordination was very powerful. And so again, I meant to mention that before, while Joe, you were still on in our Zoom room camera, but I wanted to make sure to say that as well. And to all of those who are hosting us as we are onboarding and orienting in this important and critical role. Thank you for the additional time, and we understand the impacts that this has on your regular day-to-day. So just want to make sure that you understand that it is very much appreciated. With no other items on today's agenda, I will close this meeting at 9:03 p.m. Mountain Standard Time. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a wonderful night.